Hello there, and welcome to All About Earth, where we slow down and let science unfold gently. Wherever you are right now, I hope you're comfortable. Maybe you're lying in a warm bed, maybe stretched out on the couch, or perhaps outside under the quiet glow of the stars. However your night looks, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling back in time to the Paleogene period, the era that began about 66 million years ago and lasted until roughly 23 million years ago. It came right after one of the darkest chapters in Earth's history, a time when the world had just been shaken to its core. The skies had dimmed, the forests had burned, and entire ecosystems were gone. But we're not going to talk about that moment of destruction tonight. That comes later. This part of the story is about what happened just after. The Earth you'd see then was strange, unstable, and raw. The air was heavy and humid. Rain fell acid-rich onto ash-covered ground. Oceans simmered with heat, and the climate swung wildly from hot to cold as the planet tried to find balance again. It wasn't peaceful, but it was alive, just barely. From the wreckage, small creatures began to stir. Mammals, which had spent millions of years hiding in the shadows of dinosaurs, started to explore the open world left behind. They were tiny at first, mostly no larger than a rat, but they carried something new, possibility. The Paleogene was the age of recovery, though it didn't feel gentle. Forests grew back thick and tangled. Volcanoes erupted constantly, reshaping coastlines and mountains. The oceans teemed with evolving species of fish. Birds began to take to the air in larger forms, and the early ancestors of horses, whales, and primates appeared, clumsy, experimental versions of what we know today. If you could stand there, somewhere in that recovering world, you might not recognize much. The continents were still drifting into their modern shapes. The poles, oddly enough, were covered not in ice but in dense forests where strange marsupials and crocodiles live. It was a world in flux, hot, chaotic, and full of trial and error. But beneath all the violence and uncertainty, there was a pattern forming. Life was rebuilding itself. It was slower, smaller, and tougher now, learning new strategies to survive on a planet that had changed almost overnight. So, as you settle in tonight, let your mind drift back to that beginning, the dawn after the end. The dinosaurs were gone, but the story of life was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just getting started. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through deep time, you can always like, share, or subscribe. It helps more curious minds find their way here. For now, take a breath, relax, and imagine the Earth, still smoking and strange, preparing for a new era, the Paleogene. 66 million years ago, on an otherwise ordinary day, the world changed forever. The dinosaurs, rulers of land, sea, and sky for over 160 million years, were living their usual reptilian lives, hunting, nesting, roaring, and swallowing each other whole, when something utterly indifferent to all of it came screaming out of the heavens. An asteroid, roughly 10 kilometers wide, traveling faster than a bullet by several orders of magnitude, struck the Earth near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The spot is called Chicxulub today, but back then it was just coastline, tropical, lush, and about to be vaporized. When the asteroid hit, it didn't simply crash. It punched through the planet's face. In the space of a single second, it released energy equal to about 100 million megatons of TNT, more than every nuclear weapon ever built, detonated all at once. The rock didn't even have time to slow down before it disintegrated. The crust beneath it liquefied, the ocean above it boiled, the air itself turned to plasma. Temperatures at ground zero soared higher than the surface of the sun. Within moments, a shockwave ripped across continents. Everything within thousands of kilometers was vaporized or set on fire. Trees, animals, even solid rock were turned to ash. The shock front blasted outward faster than sound, flattening forests as if the world were exhaling one last furious breath. Then came the tsunamis, waves hundreds of meters tall, that raced across the proto-Gulf of Mexico, surging into what's now North America's interior. Entire shorelines vanished. The crater it left behind was more than 80 kilometers wide and about 20 kilometers deep, gouged into the earth like a fingerprint of catastrophe. But the impact was only the beginning. The real apocalypse unfolded in the hours, days and years that followed. The asteroid had struck a region rich in sulfur-bearing rocks. When those vaporized, they released massive quantities of sulfur dioxide and dust into the atmosphere. Add carbon from burning forests and oceans, and you get a planetary-scale chemistry experiment. Sunlight-blocking aerosols, acid rain, and a choking shroud that wrapped the entire globe. Daylight vanished. Literally, the sky turned black, not cloudy, not dim, but ink black, for weeks, then months, maybe years. The sun, that steady clock of life, disappeared behind a veil of dust that scattered light and plunged the planet into a near-permanent twilight. Photosynthesis stopped almost overnight. Plants withered first. Ferns and flowering trees died, their leaves falling like green snow. Forests became skeletal, silent graveyards. The herbivores followed, starving as the world's vegetation collapsed, and behind them the carnivores, mighty and fierce, fell too, not from battle, but from hunger and cold. The global temperature dropped sharply. Scientists call it an impact winter, which sounds almost cozy, like something with blankets and cocoa. It wasn't. It was a long, frozen dusk. The heat of the impact had initially set the world ablaze. Global wildfires raged for days, ignited by falling debris heated to thousands of degrees as it re-entered the atmosphere. Every continent burned. Then, when the smoke and dust reached the stratosphere, sunlight could no longer penetrate. The fires went out not because there was nothing left to burn, but because there was no energy left to drive them. Ocean temperatures plunged. On the surface, plankton, the tiny foundation of the marine food chain, died in massive numbers as photosynthesis failed there too. The deep ocean, normally insulated from chaos above, soon followed. The chemistry of seawater changed rapidly. All that sulfur dioxide combined with water vapor to form sulfuric acid, which fell as acid rain. Rivers and seas became corrosive. Imagine swimming in a planet-wide lemon juice bath. Not ideal for shellfish or anything else with calcium in its skeleton. Coral reefs dissolved, shell-forming creatures like ammonites and many plankton species disappeared completely. With the plankton gone, everything that depended on them collapsed. Small fish starved. Bigger fish starved after them. Marine reptiles, the great mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, those terrifying sea hunters of the Mesozoic, perished as their prey vanished. The oceans went quiet, darker and emptier than they had been in hundreds of millions of years. On land, the devastation was nearly total. Forests burned and then froze. The surface of the earth alternated between furnace and freezer. Temperatures spiked for a few hours after the impact, then fell by as much as 20 degrees Celsius in a matter of days. The air filled with soot, sulfur, and carbon particles. Acid rain stripped the paint off any surviving leaves, pitted rocks and poisoned lakes. Breathing was probably unpleasant, assuming you were one of the unlucky few still doing it. For the dinosaurs, who had survived every other catastrophe the planet had thrown at them, supervolcanoes, climate swings, shifting continents, this one was simply too fast. The asteroid didn't give them millions of years to adapt. It gave them minutes. Their bodies were built for the warmth of the Cretaceous greenhouse world. The sudden dark and cold was fatal. The great predators like Tyrannosaurus rex and Giganotosaurus likely died out within weeks or months, not years. The smaller ones lasted longer, scavenging what they could but with no food chain left. Even the toughest eventually succumbed. It wasn't just dinosaurs. Roughly 3/4 of all species on Earth vanished. Flying reptiles, marine reptiles, most amphibians, countless plants and insects. Gone. The planet had hit the reset button hard. What remained was a ghost world. Imagine standing anywhere on Earth a few months after the impact. The landscape silent, except for the hiss of wind through dead trees. The air still faintly acrid from burnt carbon. The sun a weak, orange disk struggling to shine through the haze. There were no bird song choruses, no insect buzz, no thundering footsteps of giants, only stillness and decay. Geologists studying the boundary between the Cretaceous and Paleogene call it the K boundary, a thin layer of clay enriched with iridium, a rare element on Earth but common in asteroids. That iridium layer, found in rocks all over the world, is the fingerprint of that single, world-ending moment. It's there in Italy, in Colorado, in New Zealand, a quiet, grey reminder that the entire planet took a hit from the same cosmic bullet. In that layer, you can also find shocked quartz sand grains, deformed by pressures greater than anything a volcano or earthquake can produce, and tiny glassy spheres, called tektites, droplets of molten rock, flung across the world and frozen mid-flight. They are the ashes of an instant. Scientists estimate that global wildfires burned about 70% of Earth's forests in the weeks following the impact. Smoke and soot covered the globe in a black veil thick enough to block out most sunlight for years. Some models suggest that average global temperatures dropped by as much as 30 degrees Celsius in less than a year. The tropics froze. Even the ocean surface in equatorial regions may have briefly reached near freezing temperatures. And then, as the dust began to settle decades later, the greenhouse gases released by all that burning swung the pendulum back again, from impact winter to global fever. The Earth didn't just suffer one disaster, it ricocheted between extremes. It's tempting to imagine the event as one day of chaos, followed by silence. But it wasn't that neat. The planet took tens of thousands of years to stabilize. Each ecosystem collapsed in sequence like a line of dominoes. First the plants, then the herbivores, then the predators, then the scavengers and decomposers. Even microbes had to adapt to the new chemistry of the air and water. The entire biosphere shrank down to its barest essentials. And yet, from a purely physical perspective, the event was an extraordinary piece of natural engineering. A single object from space managed to reset the planet's climate, surface, and biology. The force of the impact even triggered earthquakes across the globe, with magnitudes estimated above 11, enough to cause continental shelves to collapse. Tsunamis reached as far as what's now Africa and Europe. Waves over a kilometre high crashed against coastlines. It was, in every sense, a planetary scale reset button pressed by blind chance. Imagine it in slow motion, a streak of light brighter than anything the world had ever seen, a flash so intense it would have been visible even from the far side of the planet, as the atmosphere scattered its glow. Then, within minutes, the skies filled with incandescent debris falling back through the air like billions of meteors, igniting everything below. The forests burned from above, the oceans boiled from below, and in between life clung desperately to whatever cracks and burrows could still shield it. If it all sounds apocalyptic, that's because it was. The Cretaceous world, lush, noisy, full of colossal creatures, ended in what must have felt like divine wrath, though it was nothing personal. The asteroid didn't aim for Earth, it just happened to be in the way. Cosmic accidents are like that, unfeeling, unstoppable, and profoundly effective. The extinction at the end of the Cretaceous is sometimes described as the worst day in the history of life. That's debatable. There have been even deadlier events in the deeper past, but few were as sudden, as visible, or as transformative. It ended an empire that had lasted longer than mammals have existed, and erased more than 75% of all living species in less than a geological heartbeat. In the fossil record, it's a clean break. One moment, dinosaurs everywhere, the next gone. For the Earth itself, though, it wasn't the end, it was a turning of the page. The planet, battered and blackened, kept spinning. Volcanoes continued to erupt. Rain still fell, now acidic and metallic tasting. The seas still churned, though eerily quiet. The crust cooled. Forests regrew in patches of green amid the ash. But in the long darkness that followed, the age of reptiles had truly ended. The world was empty, quiet and waiting for something else to come next. When the dust began to settle, when the fires had burned down to embers, and the skies were still grey with ash, life on Earth looked almost empty, but not entirely. Hidden beneath the silence, scattered across the planet's charred and flooded landscapes, a few small, stubborn forms of life were still breathing. They were not the strongest, nor the fiercest, nor the most spectacular. They were, in many ways, the leftovers, and yet they were exactly what the planet needed: adaptable, unassuming, and very good at making do with almost nothing. The first to take advantage of the new world weren't animals at all, but fungi. While sunlight was scarce and most green things had given up, fungi quietly got to work. They don't need light, they need death, and there was plenty of that. The forests that had once towered over continents were now vast fields of rot. Every fallen tree, every carcass, every pile of ash became a buffet for the decomposers. Spores drifted through the heavy air, landing on anything organic. Within days, the first fuzzy colonies appeared, spreading across wood, bone, and soil like nature's cleanup crew. If you had walked through a forest then, you'd have seen a strange sight. The earth covered not in green, but in grey and white, soft mats of fungus feeding on the remains of the old world. Fungi don't complain, they don't panic, they just digest. And as they worked, they began to release nutrients back into the soil. In a way, they were the first recyclers of the new age, turning decay into the foundation for what would come next. Their moment in the spotlight didn't last long in geological terms, but for a few precious years, the planet belonged to the mold. Then, in the rivers and swamps, the survivors with thicker skins and slower heartbeats began to stir, the crocodilians. These ancient reptiles had already seen many ages come and go. Unlike the dinosaurs, they didn't need sunlight or speed to stay alive. They were ambush predators, happy to eat whatever wandered too close. Fish, turtles, carrion, each other. Their secret wasn't power, it was patience. When food was scarce, they could slow their metabolism to a crawl. They could go months without eating. They could sink beneath the surface of muddy water, close their eyes, and wait for the chaos above to pass. The water was their refuge, deep in murky rivers and coastal lagoons, where the temperature stayed stable and debris from the sky couldn't reach. Crocodiles outlasted almost everything else. They didn't need lush forests or abundant prey. They needed stillness. The world outside could freeze, burn, or go dark, and the crocodile would simply drift, conserving energy, heart beating once every few minutes. It's not glamorous, but it works. In times of catastrophe, efficiency beats ambition every time. Beneath the ground, another group was waiting out the storm. Small mammals. They had been small for millions of years, scurrying under ferns, hiding from creatures that could crush them with a single step. But smallness turned out to be a blessing. Many of them lived in burrows, safe from the worst of the surface world. Underground, temperatures were stable. The air, though stale, was breathable. Some were insect eaters, some seed hoarders, some omnivores that would eat anything from roots to rotting meat. They didn't need much, and they didn't waste energy. Mammals are warm-blooded, which normally means a high energy cost, but their flexibility saved them. They could regulate their body temperature better than reptiles, allowing them to stay active even in the long chill that followed. Many were nocturnal, already adapted to living in darkness. When the sky turned black, they didn't panic. It just felt like a very long night. While the giants had depended on light and abundance, these little survivors had already mastered scarcity. They had keen noses and good memories, able to sniff out hidden food sources, buried seeds, dead insects, anything with calories. Some could enter states of torpor, slowing their metabolism almost to a standstill to ride out lean periods. And because they reproduced quickly, even small pockets of survivors could rebuild their populations fast once conditions improved. Evolution, as always, favors the flexible. Up above, in the grey skies that slowly began to clear, there were still wings. Birds, the living cousins of the dinosaurs, had found their own ways to endure. They were small, feathered, and hungry, but they had a few key advantages. Many species could migrate long distances in search of food, moving with the seasons or following the faintest traces of green. Their ability to fly meant they weren't trapped by local disasters. When one region's ecosystem failed, they could leave. Just as important, many birds ate seeds, and seeds, unlike leaves or fruit, can wait. Inside their shells, they carried tiny packets of stored energy, survival kits, built for exactly this kind of chaos. Even when the plants that produced them were gone, the seeds themselves remained scattered across the soil, dormant but edible. Birds that could crack or digest them had a reliable food source when everything else ran out. Some species also adapted their diets, shifting from insects to carrion, from fruit to roots, from anything they could catch to anything that didn't run away first. They were opportunists, not specialists, and in times of catastrophe, that's the only kind of creature that stands a chance. A bird doesn't need perfection, it just needs options. In the oceans far below the chaos at the surface, other survivors were riding out the aftermath in silence. Deep-sea fish, bottom dwellers, scavengers, they lived in darkness already, far from sunlight and surface storms. For them, the sudden absence of light made little difference. Their ecosystems depended not on photosynthesis, but on a slow rain of organic material drifting down from above, the remains of plankton, feces, and other detritus. After the impact, that rain became a blizzard. The oceans were full of debris, and though much of it was toxic, it was still food for something. Down there in the cold and pressure of the abyss, life carried on almost unchanged. The deep ocean doesn't care much about what happens on land. It moves to its own rhythm, ancient and slow. Creatures that could metabolize waste or feed on bacteria kept going. Tube worms at hydrothermal vents continued to thrive, drawing energy from Earth's internal heat rather than sunlight. If you could have looked into the deep trenches, you might have seen fish gliding through the black water as if nothing had happened, their faint bioluminescence flickering like distant stars under the sea. Across all these survivors, the fungi, the crocodiles, the mammals, the birds and the deep-sea creatures, one theme connects them: restraint. None of them tried to dominate the planet. None of them required abundance. They survived because they could endure scarcity, because they were small enough, slow enough, or strange enough to fit into the narrow spaces where death couldn't reach. They were experts in low-energy living. Fungi didn't bother with sunlight or movement. They simply absorbed. Crocodiles learned to wait, turning patience into an art form. Mammals used warmth and curiosity, adapting to the dark. Birds used mobility and seeds as lifelines. Fish used depth as armor. Each found its own niche of calm in the storm. It's almost poetic. The earth had reset itself, and those who lived through it were not the conquerors, but the quiet ones. You might call them lucky, but luck favors those who don't overcomplicate survival. These species didn't try to change the world. They simply persisted within it. They didn't chase glory or size or dominance. They focused on the essentials: eat, rest, hide, wait. That simplicity is its own form of intelligence. If you were to imagine Earth whispering to them in that dark, chaotic time, you might hear it say something like, "Don't fight, adapt." And they listened. They hunkered down, adjusted, and endured. No speeches, no drama, just survival in its purest form. For years, perhaps centuries, life remained muted. Fungal spores filled the air. Crocodiles drifted through rivers lined with ash. Mammals tunneled in the dirt, emerging only when the air cleared a little. Birds picked through the wreckage, scavenging seeds, and in the depths fish moved slowly through the cold, steady black. It wasn't a vibrant world, but it was a persistent one. In those fragile ecosystems, evolution was quietly taking notes. The traits that had saved these creatures, flexibility, efficiency, endurance, would become the new currency of life on Earth. For now, though, the survivors weren't planning the future. They were just trying to make it to the next sunrise, if the sun could even be seen. And somehow they did. They kept the heartbeat of the planet going when everything else had gone silent. The fungi finished their feast, cleaning up the wreckage. The crocodiles outlived yet another era, as they still do today. The small mammals, blinking their bright eyes in the darkness, carried within them the seeds of something astonishing to come. The birds, descendants of the sky's greatest rulers, flapped their way through the haze, carrying life across continents. The fish in the deep kept swimming, unaware that the world above had nearly ended. In the long story of Earth, survival isn't glamorous. It's quiet, often invisible, and built on compromise. These survivors didn't win because they were brave or clever. They won because they could bend without breaking, because they knew when to wait, when to hide, when to use less instead of more. The age of giants was gone. In its place, the world belonged, for a while, to the small, the patient, and the persistent. They were not many, but they were enough. The planet had whispered, "Live if you can," and they had answered, softly, stubbornly, yes. For a long time the world stayed dim. Ash still drifted in the upper air, the smell of burnt carbon lingered on every breeze, and the sun was little more than a rumor behind the haze. But time, patient, unbothered, relentless, kept moving. Slowly and perceptibly, the dust began to fall. Grain by grain, the skies cleared. What had been an endless twilight softened to a hazy dawn. The first beams of sunlight, weak and golden, pushed through the thinning clouds. After years of darkness, the earth exhaled. If there had been anyone around to witness it, they might have noticed how quiet the light was. It didn't burst in triumphantly. It arrived like a whisper. It touched the cracked soil, the skeletons half buried in ash, the blackened stumps of trees. It glinted faintly on pools of still water and illuminated the delicate threads of fungal webs that had wrapped the landscape in a ghostly film. The sunlight returned cautiously, as if testing whether the world was ready to see again. When it did, something remarkable began. From the charred ground, the first green shoots pushed upward. They were not mighty oaks or tall conifers, but ferns, resilient, ancient ferns. Their spores had lingered in the soil, protected underground, waiting for just a hint of warmth and light. When that warmth finally came, they sprouted as if on cue. Ferns are often the first to reclaim devastation. It's one of their specialties: volcanic ash, floodplains, even impact craters wherever the world resets. Ferns arrive like optimistic pioneers. Within a few seasons, patches of green spread across the grey landscape, delicate fronds uncurling like little flags of victory. The sight of greenery must have transformed everything. The colour alone, green, alive, hopeful, would have been shocking after so much darkness. The ferns didn't grow tall, but they grew everywhere, carpeting the hills, the riverbanks, the edges of lakes still murky from chemical chaos. With them came other plants, conifers, the hardy gymnosperms that had endured countless climate swings before. Their seeds, carried by wind, landed in cracks and crevices, sprouting where soil was just deep enough to hold. They reached upward slowly, sending roots into the mineral-rich ground. The soil itself had changed. All those bones, all that ash, had left behind a chemical legacy. The calcium and phosphorus from decaying skeletons, the mighty remains of reptiles, fish and birds, enriched the earth. The carbon from burnt forests created layers of fertile black sediment. The planet, in a strange way, had composted its own tragedy. What was once death had become nourishment. New roots drank from that mineral feast, and the ground that had once been sterile dust began to hum with chemistry again. Rain returned, soft and persistent. The droplets washed away the soot, cut grooves into the ash, and carried nutrients downstream. Rivers that had run thick with mud and acid now began to clear, turning a more familiar blue-green. The air smelled different, still sharp, still sulphurous in places, but now tinged with the scent of wet soil and fresh growth. The atmosphere's balance shifted as the first plants began to breathe again. With every fern and every tree that sprouted, a tiny trickle of oxygen joined the air, pushing back the heavy carbon dioxide and sulfur that had ruled for too long. Insects were quick to notice. The world might still have been rough, but for them it was open real estate. Beetles crawled across fallen logs, dragonflies skimmed the new ponds, and early pollinators explored the ferns and cycads for spores and sap. The buzzing returned. It wasn't loud yet, but it was steady, a small chorus of persistence. The insects had an advantage in this stage of recovery. They were mobile, adaptable, and not picky. A bit of decaying wood here, a patch of moss there, it was enough to start rebuilding their tiny empires. And where insects go, others follow. Small creatures began to creep and crawl through the undergrowth. Sniffing, nibbling, nesting, the land that had been silent began to move again. Softly at first, the soundscape of the world, buzzes, rustles, drips, was returning. The earth's pulse was faint but steady. The forests that grew from this new beginning were not grand in the way the old ones had been. They were patchy, uneven, experimental. Trees leaned at odd angles, their trunks thin and pale. The soil was still young, its structure fragile, but nature doesn't care about perfection. It only cares about continuity. As the canopy began to form, shadows returned to the ground, and with them came complexity. Microclimates, little ecosystems forming within ecosystems. Fungi remained part of this story, now not as the dominant recyclers of death, but as partners in new life. Underground, their mycelial threads wove through the soil, connecting plant roots in invisible networks. Through these networks, plants could share water and nutrients. A kind of corporation had emerged from the chaos. The fungi that had once fed on destruction were now helping creation thrive. It was the Earth's way of turning its own wounds into wisdom. In lakes and shallow seas, algae returned, painting the water with shades of green and brown. Sunlight, now filtering more easily through the atmosphere, warmed the surface layers. Photosynthesis resumed in earnest. Tiny oxygen bubbles shimmered upward through the water column, the first signs of balance returning. With time, plankton would multiply again, but for now, it was enough that they had begun. If you could stand there and watch the planet during these first years of recovery, you might not call it beautiful, at least not at first. It would have been muddy, smoky, unstable. Forests of ferns waving in uneven patches. Rivers clogged with debris. But there would be something deeply moving about it, an unmistakable sense of determination. The Earth wasn't giving up. It was starting over, the only way it knew how. One leaf, one spore, one drop of rain at a time. Everywhere you looked, life was testing the boundaries of possibility. Plants pushed through cracks in rocks that had been melted and fused by impact. Moss grew on bones. Tiny freshwater snails clung to pebbles, feeding on films of algae that had only just appeared. It was as if the entire planet had decided, collectively, to try again. The recovery was not fast. Nature doesn't do fast, but it was relentless. And as sunlight continued to strengthen, the rhythm of day and night returned to something close to normal. The world began to warm slightly. Temperatures stabilized. The endless storms eased. Weather patterns found a new balance. The rain still fell acid-rich in places, but each shower diluted the old poisons a little more. The Earth's atmosphere cleared, its oceans calmed, its skin scarred, blackened, and scoured began to heal. In this new equilibrium, the air shimmered with dust motes and the faint scent of pine. Spores floated like golden flecks in sunlight. Forests of young trees reached cautiously toward the sky. They were different from the lush jungles that had once ruled the world, but in their simplicity, they were pure beginnings. The remains of the old world didn't vanish. Fossil bones jutted from hillsides, weathered and pale. Fallen skeletons were slowly buried by sediment, turned to minerals, or dissolved to feed the next generation. In a sense, the old giants became the soil for the new. The earth recycled everything, down to the last vertebra. There was a strange humor in that. The bones of thunderous beasts now helping ferns grow taller, a reminder that even extinction has its uses. As the ecosystems rebuilt themselves, new patterns began to emerge. Food webs formed out of necessity. Plants captured sunlight, insects consumed them, and small scavengers ate the insects. The balance was delicate, easily disturbed, but it was enough to get things moving again. Life, once knocked flat, had regained its footing. The recovery was not a straight line. There were setbacks, cold snaps, lingering chemical shocks, long dry spells, but compared to what had come before, these were mild inconveniences. Each season, the green spread a little farther. Forests reclaimed the floodplains. Grass-like plants began to appear, modest pioneers of open ground. The sky turned bluer, the clouds whiter. The world began to look familiar again. It's tempting to imagine the planet as having moods, and if that were true, this would have been a moment of cautious optimism. The Earth, after an age of fire and shadow, was learning to smile again. It wasn't a triumphant grin, more like a shy one, the kind that comes after tears. Even the sunlight seemed to have softened warmer now, filtered through cleaner air. The land glittered faintly with minerals, washed smooth by rain. The scars were still there, but they were fading under a new coat of green. If the earlier chaos had been a shout, this recovery was a sigh, gentle, persistent, and full of quiet purpose. The Earth didn't rush. It knew that restoration isn't an event, it's a process. Light doesn't conquer darkness in an instant. It seeps back in, slow and certain. The same was true of life. There was no grand unveiling, no single moment when everything was back to normal. There was only gradual renewal, day by day, cell by cell, inch by inch. And as the ferns thickened, the trees multiplied, and the insects filled the air, something invisible was happening too. The chemistry of the planet was being rewritten. Every new leaf drew in carbon dioxide and released oxygen. Every decomposing root returned minerals to the soil. Every rainstorm mixed nutrients and spread them farther. The biosphere, the delicate partnership between rock, water, air, and life, was reforming its bonds. Eventually, the forests grew dense enough that wind could whistle through them again. Rain could drum on leaves. Rivers could murmur as they wound through valleys. The earth had sound again, texture again, movement again. It had rhythm. And if you could step back and see the planet from afar, you'd notice the color change. What had been grey and brown after the catastrophe was now streaked with green and blue again. Oceans reflected the sky, forests shimmered across the continents, and the thin atmosphere glowed faintly with oxygen and dust, just like before but not quite. This was a new Earth, born from the ashes of the old one, carrying forward the memory of destruction, but no longer ruled by it. There's a quiet lesson hidden in this chapter of Earth's story. Recovery is never instant, never clean, and never perfect. But it happens. Life doesn't ask for permission. It just finds a way. Give it a little light, a little warmth, and a little time, and it will return different, humbler, but alive. The dust had cleared, the sun had returned, and the world, against all odds, was growing again. The forests that rose from those first ferns were still young, still fragile, but they were the foundation of everything that would come after. The stage was set, the light was back, and the earth for the first time in a very long while could breathe deeply again. The age of restoration had begun. The sun was back, the skies were blue again, and the earth was breathing. But peace never lasts long here. The planet doesn't do stillness. It shifts. It experiments. It argues with itself. The Paleogene period, stretching from about 66 to 23 million years ago, was a masterclass in restlessness. The world had just pulled itself out of catastrophe, and now it was rearranging the furniture. Continents drifted, climates flipped, mountains rose, oceans stirred, and life, always eager, always impatient, decided to reinvent itself completely. It began hot, not summer vacation hot, not tropical beach hot. It was greenhouse hot, an atmosphere thick with carbon dioxide that turned the world into a global sauna. Rainforests stretched all the way to the poles. Crocodiles lounged in what's now Canada. Palms grew in Antarctica. It was as if Earth had decided to overcorrect for its earlier chill, flinging the thermostat to maximum and leaving the door open. The Paleocene, the first chapter of this period, was lush, steamy, and a little bit unhinged. Everything grew fast and thick. The air itself probably smelled like sap and wet soil. But while the climate was busy sweating, the land beneath was moving. The continents were still on the drift that had begun back when dinosaurs ruled, and now they were starting to bump into each other in awkward, dramatic ways. The African plate slammed slowly into the Eurasian one, and the collision sent up wrinkles that would one day become the Alps. Farther east, India was on a collision course with Asia, a geological car crash in slow motion that raised the Himalayas, the highest mountain range on the planet. It was tectonic chaos, and every jolt reshaped wind patterns, rainfall, and coastlines. Meanwhile, the oceans were becoming more organized, or more mischievous, depending on your view. In the southern hemisphere, Antarctica began to drift toward isolation. As it moved farther from its neighboring continents, currents started circling around it, trapping cold water and cutting off the flow of warmth from the north. That spinning band of icy current, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, would eventually become one of the most powerful forces on Earth, chilling the southern seas and setting the stage for future ice ages. But for now, the planet was still basking in its tropical experiment. The early Paleogene was like a long fever dream. Temperatures soared, sea levels rose, and the world buzzed with strange new life. Yet even within that heat, instability brewed. The Earth has a habit of correcting its own excesses, and it does so dramatically. About 56 million years ago, something happened. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, a mouthful of a name for a sudden global meltdown. Huge amounts of carbon were released into the atmosphere, possibly from volcanoes, possibly from thawing methane trapped in seabed ice, or maybe from both. Temperatures spiked again, oceans acidified, and rainforests turned into steam rooms. For about 200,000 years, the planet sweated it out like a sauna addict who didn't know when to stop. And then just as suddenly, the fever broke. Temperatures cooled, slowly at first, then sharply. The Earth flipped its mood as if realizing it had gone too far. Over the next few million years, the warm, wet world gave way to cooler and drier climates. The lush jungles began to thin out. Grass, simple, stubborn, sun-loving grass, started to spread across open plains. It didn't look like much, just low green blades, but it would end up changing everything. Grasses turned soil into food factories, their roots holding dirt in place and trapping carbon underground. They set the stage for the great grazing ecosystems to come. But at this point, they were still pioneers in a world learning how to be less tropical. The shifting climate kept life on its toes. Warm epochs alternated with cool snaps. Rainforests came and went. Inland seas dried up, then refilled somewhere else. The continents continued their slow dance, South America drifting farther from Africa, North America inching toward Europe, and Australia breaking away from Antarctica like a roommate who'd finally had enough. Each movement redrew the map of ocean currents, which redrew the map of climate. Patterns of wind and rain changed, deserts appeared, and coastal ecosystems shifted from coral reefs to mudflats and back again. This geological reshuffling wasn't just about scenery. It was an engine for evolution. When land masses connect, species migrate and mix. When they separate, species diverge and specialize. The Paleogene was full of these tectonic door openings and closings. At times, continents formed temporary bridges, land connections that allowed animals to wander far beyond their ancestral homes. North America and Eurasia, for instance, were linked by Arctic routes, letting creatures cross from one to the other during cooler intervals. South America, still mostly isolated, developed its own peculiar wildlife that would remain strange for millions of years. Everywhere, ecosystems were experimenting. Some regions looked like giant laboratories where evolution was running trial after trial. The world didn't have a clear plan. It was improvising. Rivers wound through forests that seemed half tropical, half temperate. Volcanoes erupted, adding minerals to the soil and carbon to the air. Mountains scraped against the sky, creating rain shadows and carving valleys where new species could take root. The Earth was reshaping not only its surface, but its possibilities. By the middle of the Paleogene, the Eocene epoch, the planet was a paradox, both familiar and alien. Mammals were multiplying, birds were diversifying, insects were everywhere, and yet the climate remained unpredictable. The poles were still forested, with redwoods and dawn sequoias growing where ice would one day rain. In what's now Wyoming, warm swamps teemed with crocodiles and turtles. Europe and Asia were tropical, full of palm trees and dense jungles. The air was humid, the skies thick with moisture, and rain fell often. It was an era of exuberance, but also of volatility. Eventually, around 34 million years ago, the pendulum swung again, this time toward cold. Antarctica, now fully isolated, began to freeze. Ice sheets formed for the first time in millions of years. Sea levels dropped. The oceans reorganized once more, and the Great Antarctic Current locked in a new global climate system. The Eocene gave way to the Oligocene, and the Earth, once a greenhouse, became an early version of what we'd recognize today. A planet with seasons, polar ice, and expanding grasslands. You might say the Paleogene was Earth's adolescence. It had survived a traumatic childhood and was now growing, stretching, trying new identities. Sometimes it wore a tropical mask, sometimes a temperate one, sometimes something in between. It tested climates like moods, shifting from sweaty to sulky without warning. And beneath that atmospheric drama, the continents kept drifting, like tectonic teenagers rolling their eyes and slamming doors. The planet's internal machinery was busy too. Volcanoes were everywhere, not just spewing lava, but exhaling gases that reshaped the atmosphere. Each eruption was both destruction and creation, releasing minerals that would one day feed new ecosystems. The air may have been thick, but it was fertile. Rain washed volcanic ash into rivers, rivers carried it to the seas, and the seas turned it into the raw ingredients for marine life. Every eruption, every mountain, every shifting fault line added texture to the planet's experiment. It's almost funny how much chaos it takes to make order. The Paleogene was messy, unstable, sometimes violent, and yet, out of that churn came the stability of the modern world. The continents found positions that would last into the present. Ocean currents established steady loops. The balance between hot and cold, wet and dry, began to settle into a pattern. Not calm exactly, but rhythm. The earth had found its tempo. There's a strange beauty in imagining this world. Picture mountains rising where there had been sea, forests stretching where glaciers would one day grow. Imagine lush valleys under skies hazy with volcanic ash, rivers full of strange fish, and plains just beginning to shimmer with the first experiments of grass. It was a planet alive in motion, never the same 2 million years in a row. And through it all, the Earth seemed to whisper, try something new. It pushed species to adapt, to migrate, to diversify. It pushed landscapes to shift and reform. It pushed the climate to swing until balance emerged by accident. The Paleogene wasn't a calm after the storm, it was the storm learning how to build again. The story of this period is one of reinvention through turbulence. The Earth was sculpting itself, making mistakes, starting over, and creating new worlds on the ruins of the old. In its heat and cold, its mountains and oceans, its constant motion, it set the stage for the planet we know. By the end of the Paleogene, the outlines of the modern Earth were beginning to appear. The continents had settled into familiar shapes. The ocean currents had found their flow. Ice sparkled on the southern pole. Grass spread like a quiet revolution across continents. The climate was still capricious, but no longer lethal. The chaos had calmed somewhat. It was a time of transformation, the kind that never announces itself, but leaves traces everywhere, in the tilt of a mountain range, in the minerals of the soil, in the very air we breathe. The Paleogene was not gentle, but it was generous. Out of fire and flood, it gave the world new energy, new landscapes, and new possibilities. And if you could have stood anywhere on Earth then, from the cooling tropics of Asia to the newborn ice sheets of the South, you would have felt it, the pulse of a planet still reinventing itself, still humming with potential. The Earth had learned something from its near-death experience, that destruction and creation are not opposites. They are part of the same rhythm. The Paleogene was that rhythm made visible, a time when the world burned, froze, shifted, and sighed its way into something new. A world in motion, unpredictable, alive. The chaos had purpose, and the rebirth was underway. The planet wasn't done yet. Not even close. It was only getting started. After all the smoke, ash, and chaos, when the world had finally stopped burning and started breathing again, something small began to move through the ferns. It wasn't a dinosaur or a bird or a crocodile. It was furry, cautious, and probably adorable in a scruffy sort of way. If you looked closely, you might have seen a pair of bright eyes glinting in the half-dark, whiskers twitching, paws clutching a seed or maybe a beetle. Meet the early mammals of the Paleogene, the little survivors who would quietly set the stage for everything to come. They weren't impressive by Mesozoic standards. After all, the world had just lost creatures the size of buses and apartment buildings. These new players were about the size of your hand or maybe your foot if they were feeling ambitious. But in a world stripped bare, small was good. Small meant nimble. Small meant quiet. Small meant unnoticed by whatever dangers still lingered. And in evolutionary terms, unnoticed is a great way to stay alive. Among these first pioneers was a creature called Purgatorius. The name sounds dramatic, like something from a heavy metal album, but the animal itself was anything but. It was tiny, mouse-sized, soft-furred, with a long tail and nimble fingers. It probably weighed no more than a couple of ounces, but it carried within its genes the potential for primates, for everything from lemurs to humans. Purgatorius was not aware of its destiny. Of course, it was too busy foraging. Imagine it in the dim underbrush of a recovering forest, sniffing the air. The world around it was still raw, still strange. The trees were young, the soil freshly mixed with ash, and the air still carried the faint metallic scent of the old disaster. But for Purgatorius, it was paradise. The forests were full of insects, seeds, and fruiting plants trying out new tricks. There were few predators left, and plenty of room to explore. It scurried, climbed, and nibbled, an omnivore in the truest sense, willing to eat anything that didn't eat it first. Omnivory is one of evolution's cleverest survival strategies. If you're picky, you die when your food disappears. But if you're flexible, berries today, beetles tomorrow, a bit of bark next week, you can keep going no matter what the world throws at you. Purgatorius and its relatives mastered that art. Their small teeth could handle both soft fruit and crunchy insects. Their stomachs could improvise. They were generalists, and in a time when specialization meant extinction, generalists thrived. These early mammals were nocturnal too, a habit inherited from the days when dinosaurs ruled the daylight. For millions of years, their ancestors had lived in the shadows, darting out only when the giant reptiles slept. Their eyes had adapted to low light, their hearing sharpened, their sense of smell honed. Even when the dinosaurs were gone, night still felt like home. Under the cover of darkness, they hunted, foraged, and mated, listening to the forest creak and sigh around them. They were small, but they were busy. Their energy burned hot, warm-blooded engines that required constant fueling to keep that metabolism running. They needed food often, and their foraging never stopped for long. They slept in short bursts, nested in hidden burrows or hollows, and scurried out again as soon as it was safe. Their lives were short and fast, measured in seasons rather than decades, but every generation adapted a little more to the new world taking shape around them. Climbing was another trick up their tiny sleeves. Purgatorius and many of its cousins were built for trees, small claws for gripping bark, long tails for balance, and flexible joints for quick adjustments. In a landscape where the ground was cluttered with debris, the trees were highways of opportunity. Up there, insects were plentiful, fruits dangled like treasure, and the view helped spot trouble before it arrived. Evolution had rewarded agility and curiosity, and these creatures had both in abundance. You might imagine them moving through the forest canopy, hopping between branches, sniffing at berries, chasing small spiders who weren't elegant, more like a cross between a squirrel and a shrew. But they were effective. Every day was a small adventure of survival. A quick climb here, a jump there, a frantic scramble away from something larger with teeth. Life wasn't peaceful, but it was rich in possibilities. The variety among these early mammals was already impressive. Some were insectivores with narrow snouts and sharp teeth, perfect for snatching beetles from the bark. Others were seed-eaters with flatter molars and rounder faces. Some glided between trees. Some stayed closer to the forest floor, digging through leaf litter for worms and roots. Each species found its niche, testing different ways to make a living. Nature, as always, was running experiments. Some would fail, but some would become blueprints for the future. And while they were small, their brains were getting bigger. That's one of the secret weapons of mammals: curiosity backed by computation. Even at this early stage, these creatures were learning, remembering, problem-solving in miniature. A tiny mammal that could recall where fruit ripened, or how to reach a nest without falling, had a better shot at survival. Neural connections strengthened, senses sharpened. In their tiny skulls, evolution was quietly building the foundation for intelligence. The climate around them wasn't exactly cooperative. The Paleogene was an age of extremes, heat waves, cool snaps, storms that could flatten entire forests. But the small mammals took it all in stride. When it was too hot, they retreated to burrows. When it was too cold, they huddled in nests of moss and leaves. When the rains came, they climbed higher. When drought hit, they dug deeper. Flexibility was their superpower. Big animals might rule in times of stability, but in a chaotic world, the small ones hold the advantage. These early mammals also knew how to disappear. Camouflage was their silent skill. Their fur blended with bark and leaf. Their movements were quick and darting, never lingering long enough for anything to notice. Even their hearts seemed to beat in whispers, a few grams of muscle, fur, and determination that was enough to outlast the giants. They reproduced fast, Another crucial trick. A short lifespan means you don't have time to waste. Many of these early species could produce several litters a year. Each new generation arrives slightly altered, slightly improved, slightly more attuned to whatever the environment demanded. Evolution wasn't working in centuries, it was working in months. Every shift in temperature, every change in vegetation was another test, and they passed by simply persisting. If you'd been able to zoom out, if you could have seen the world from above, you'd have noticed these mammals spreading everywhere, across the continents from North America to Asia, from the recovering forests of Europe to the steamy tropics. Small furred creatures scuttled and climbed and burrowed. They were the first wave of a new kind of life taking over the planet, one built on adaptability instead of size. Their diversity exploded quietly. There were proto-primates like Purgatorius, but also early relatives of hoofed mammals, small insectivores that would one day give rise to elephants and whales, and tiny rodent-like species perfecting the art of gnawing. Each one was a small note in a vast evolutionary symphony, the melody still forming, but the rhythm already strong. The forests of the Paleogene were alive with their rustling. At night, you could hear them everywhere. Soft scratching, rustles in the leaves, faint chirps and squeaks. They were the background music of the age, easily overlooked, but impossible to silence. The dinosaurs had ruled through spectacle. These mammals ruled through persistence. Even the way they moved spoke of possibility. They didn't just walk or run. They scurried, climbed, leapt, swam. Evolution had taken the basic mammalian blueprint and started bending it in every direction. Hands became paws, paws became graspers, tails became balancing poles, or fat reserves, or nothing at all. Every generation was a small adjustment towards something new. In their behavior, there was also the first glimmer of what we'd later call personality. These weren't mindless creatures following instinct alone. They were improvisers. Some individuals were bold, exploring new areas and new foods. Others were cautious, staying close to familiar ground. Both strategies worked, and both were passed on. Life was inventing choice, one whisker twitch at a time. And perhaps most remarkable of all, they cooperated, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident. A group of small mammals might share a network of burrows, warning each other of danger with high-pitched chirps. Others built nests that became homes for insects and fungi, creating tiny ecosystems of their own. In a world that had once been dominated by solo hunters and solitary giants, cooperation was a quiet revolution. It's easy to overlook creatures like Purgatorius in the grand timeline of life. They don't have the glamour of the dinosaurs or the grandeur of the mammoths that would come later. But these tiny mammals carried the genetic blueprints for everything that followed. Without them, there would be no whales, no lions, no apes, no us. They were the spark that caught, the humble beginning that made complexity possible. Picture one of them, perched on a branch just before dawn. The air is cool, the world still damp from last night's rain. It sniffs the breeze, catching the scent of fruit somewhere nearby. Its claws grip the bark. It pauses, listening, calculating. Then it leaps, tail flicking for balance, landing with the precision of instinct, honed by a million trials. It's small, it's cautious, but it's perfect for this world. The Earth, in its quiet way, seemed to approve. The planet's message was clear. Stay small, stay clever, stay curious. That combination would prove unstoppable. The mammals, once the overlooked shadows of prehistory, were now the engineers of the future. They didn't know it, of course. To them, life was just an endless cycle of finding food, avoiding teeth, and keeping warm. But every tiny heartbeat echoed a promise that from small beginnings, great things grow. They were the pioneers, the testers of what was possible. Their paws wrote the first lines of the next great chapter. In their tiny, whiskered faces, the age of mammals had already begun. For tens of millions of years after the end of the dinosaurs, the world belonged to the small, the quick, the furtive, the ones who could fit through cracks in bark and sleep safely under leaves. But the Earth was changing again. The forests that had once cloaked entire continents began to thin. The climate cooled and dried, and open spaces stretched wider than ever before. Grasses spread across the land like green fire, and where there is endless grass, there is an invitation. Grow bigger. The planet, in its quiet and relentless way, seemed to whisper to its creatures, "You can stand tall now." And so they did. The age of mammals began with shadows in the underbrush, but it grew into something far grander, a world of titans built from fur, bone, and patience. It's hard to imagine that the ancestors of these giants were once no larger than mice. Yet over the span of the Paleogene and beyond, evolution cranked the dial of body size upward with enthusiasm. Tiny omnivores became herbivores the size of horses. Small grazers became behemoths that made trees look nervous. Nature had discovered a new trick: bulk. Growing large had its advantages. In the expanding grasslands, food was abundant, but spread out. Being small meant burning too much energy searching for it. Being big meant you could travel farther, digest tougher plants, and store energy against droughts. A large body also meant fewer predators to fear. The Paleogene landscape had its hunters, of course, sleek, sharp-toothed newcomers testing the balance of power, but none yet had the scale or coordination to challenge a truly massive grazer. Size for a time was its own kind of armor. One of the greatest champions of this new arms race in size was Parasauritherium, sometimes called the giant hornless rhinoceros. The name doesn't do it justice. It stood nearly 5 meters at the shoulder and could stretch its head into treetops 7 meters above the ground. Imagine a creature taller than a giraffe, heavier than an elephant, but shaped like neither, long-limbed, with a head that looked designed to politely nibble at branches no one else could reach. It was, by every metric, enormous. And yet, by all accounts, gentle. Parasauritherium wandered across the ancient plains of what's now Asia, quietly stripping trees of their leaves and swallowing entire bushes. It probably consumed hundreds of kilograms of vegetation a day. Each footstep would have sounded like a muffled drumbeat through the earth. To see one move across the savannah must have been like watching a slow, deliberate piece of weather drift by, a cloud of muscle and calm appetite. Its ancestors had been modest-sized, four-legged browsers not much larger than sheep, but generation after generation, natural selection had favored those who could reach higher and digest more, until the result was this: the largest land mammal to ever live. The Earth, of course, didn't hand out gigantism for free. A big body came with big challenges. Heat was harder to shed, food harder to find, offspring slower to raise. But evolution is nothing if not inventive. Mammals developed efficient lungs, complex digestion, and cooling systems built right into their blood flow. Some grew longer limbs for walking great distances. Others developed multiple stomach chambers to ferment and reprocess tough grass. It was engineering at planetary scale, carried out one genetic tweak at a time. Grass itself had something to say in this story. It was a new kind of plant, tough, silica-rich, abrasive. To eat it required specialized teeth. Over millions of years, mammal mouths transformed into grinding machines. Enamel thickened, jaws strengthened, skulls reshaped to fit larger chewing muscles. If evolution had a soundtrack, this era would be full of crunching noises. Every bite wore down teeth like sandpaper, but that was fine. New generations came with better molars, sharper designs. Grazing became a lifestyle, and the open plains turned into arenas of endless chewing. The climate drove much of this transformation. After the humid warmth of the early Paleogene, the planet began to cool and dry. Forests receded, deserts expanded, and the temperate belts grew wide and breezy. Wind raced across the grasslands, carrying dust and seeds and the distant calls of animals that had learned to run. Because in the open, running mattered. For the first time, speed became survival. The herbivores grew fast and powerful legs to escape their predators. The predators, in turn, evolved to match them. Each innovation sparked another. Hooves appeared, streamlining limbs for efficient strides. Spines and muscles reorganized for endurance. The ancient mammals were stretching themselves into new shapes, some for grazing, some for pursuit, some simply for the art of movement. The ground shook with life again, not from dinosaurs this time, but from their unlikely replacements. And yet, for all their size and strength, these giants were not without grace. You can imagine a herd of early rhinoceros-like creatures moving through a Paleogene valley at sunrise. The air is cool, the ground damp with dew. Massive shoulders roll beneath thick hides. Calves stumble beside their mothers. A faint wind stirs the grasses, carrying scents of distant rivers and volcanic soil. It's a calm scene, but beneath it hums a quiet power, the same biological ambition that had once lifted reptiles to glory. The mammals were rising, not in rage or conquest, but in inevitability. Other species joined the march towards size. Brontosaurs, strange, horned herbivores with massive bodies and bony crests, thundered across the land in herds. Titanosaur males probably clashed head-to-head in displays of dominance, shaking the ground with their collisions. Early proboscideans, the ancestors of elephants, appeared already experimenting with long noses and strong tusks. Their bodies ballooned to match their appetites, and their appetites grew to match the planet's bounty. Everything was scaling upward, as though the very physics of life had tilted in favor of enormity. Even the carnivores evolved to keep pace. Giant flightless birds with hooked beaks patrolled the plains, and ancient mammalian predators began stretching their forms, becoming sleeker and faster to chase the new prey. Evolution was in overdrive. If the earlier ages had been about survival, this one was about competition, innovation, and the return of spectacle. The world was loud again. Yet, despite the violence and the noise, there was humor in it too. The earth seemed to be experimenting with extremes. What if I make a horse the size of a truck? What if I add tusks? Maybe 2 horns, or none? Let's see what happens. Some designs thrived, others failed. But the spirit of the age was experimentation. The mammals were trying everything: hooves, claws, trunks, horns, antlers, humps, tails like flags. It was as if evolution, freed from its long hibernation, had decided to throw a party. Of course, not every part of the planet looked the same. In some regions, rainforests persisted, filled with smaller, more delicate creatures. In others, wetlands teemed with amphibians and crocodiles that had survived the chaos. But the dominant tone of the age was open space, vast savannas under shifting skies, where thunderclouds rolled in the afternoons and herds migrated with the seasons. The world had gone wide, and the mammals filled it with footsteps. Each adaptation was a dialogue with the earth itself. As mountains rose, species adapted to altitude and cold. As deserts expanded, others learned to conserve water. The large herbivores that roamed these lands weren't simply eating, they were sculpting the planet. Their grazing patterns changed vegetation, their migrations carried seeds, their droppings fertilized the soil. The very landscape breathed through them. You could say that the earth was not just home to these creatures, it was collaborating with them. And as bodies grew larger, so did social lives. Many of these giants moved in groups, finding safety and company in numbers. Herds formed for migration, protection, and perhaps even companionship. Watching them, you might have seen the beginnings of behaviors that would one day define modern mammals: communication, cooperation, parenting, and even mourning. Intelligence was scaling up too. Big brains followed big bodies. Not always, but often enough to matter. The success of these mammals wasn't guaranteed, of course. The climate would continue to shift, testing every adaptation. Some lineages would die out, leaving fossils as silent monuments to ambition. Others would persist, refining their designs until they became the elephants, rhinos, and hippos we know today. But during the Paleogene, none of that was written yet. The world was a living draft, and every hoofprint was a line of evolution in progress. If you could step back and watch this transformation unfold across millions of years, it would look almost cinematic. Small shapes scurrying through forests giving way to larger silhouettes striding through grass, the horizon filling with movement, the earth itself vibrating under the weight of new life. The soundtrack would be wind, thunder, and the low murmur of chewing. There's something poetic about how quickly the balance shifted. In a geological blink, mammals went from hiding to towering. The world had flipped its script. The tiny, nervous survivors of an ancient apocalypse had taken a deep breath and become giants. They were not perfect, not permanent, but for a time they ruled the land with quiet confidence. If the earlier epochs had been a story of recovery, this one was a story of mastery. The Earth, with its restless continents and swinging climates, had created the conditions for growth on a colossal scale. Life had answered, challenge accepted, and so the plains filled with the sound of footsteps, heavy enough to shake the ground. The air trembled with the calls of enormous throats. The trees bowed under the reach of towering grazers. The age of giants had arrived, born not from arrogance, but from the simple, irresistible pull of opportunity. In their shadow, the world seemed smaller, but also more alive. Each great creature was a monument to persistence, to adaptation, to the relentless creativity of life itself. From something that once fit in your palm came something that could block out the sun. The earth had whispered, grow, and they had listened. And in their rising, the planet found a new kind of balance. Bigger, louder, slower, but no less beautiful. The mammals had taken their place among the world's wonders, proving once again that in the grand experiment of life, small beginnings can lead to enormous results. The story of life on Earth is full of wanderers, creatures that dared to leave one world behind and try another. Some crawled from the water onto land, lungs gasping their first uncertain breaths. But much later, a few remarkable mammals decided to do the opposite. They looked at the ocean, the endless shimmer of blue stretching beyond the horizon, and thought, let's go back. It sounds absurd, even now, to return to the sea after millions of years of walking on solid ground. But in the Paleogene, when the Earth was still experimenting with new forms and new frontiers, one lineage of mammals did exactly that. And from their strange, elegant rebellion came the first wave. It began on land, with something small, four-legged, and curious. Picture a creature about the size of a wolf, with hooves instead of paws and a long snout built for sniffing out riverbanks. It's hard to imagine this animal as the ancestor of whales, yet that's exactly what it was. Scientists call them archaeosaurs, ancient whales, and they were at first nothing of the sort. They walked, they trotted, they probably wagged their tails, but they lived close to water, and water was where the opportunities lay. In a world of rising temperatures and expanding seas, rivers, lagoons, and coastal shallows teemed with fish and new prey. Life is nothing if not opportunistic. The mammals followed the food. At first, it was just dipping toes, or rather hooves, into the water. They waded and paddled, snapping at fish or crustaceans, discovering that swimming had its advantages. Over generations, they became better at it. Their legs grew more muscular, their spines more flexible, their eyes, once tuned for land, adapted to the shifting light underwater. Gradually, they spent more and more time in the shallows, until one day, perhaps some of them stopped coming back to shore at all. Evolution doesn't rush, but it does keep walking, or in this case, swimming forward. As the Eocene epoch unfolded, these pioneering mammals transformed. Their descendants grew sleeker, their bodies elongating into torpedo shapes that sliced through the waves with surprising grace. Their limbs flattened into paddles, their nostrils began to slide upward, inch by inch, toward the top of the skull, a quiet architectural project that would one day result in the blowhole. Their ears adapted to hear underwater vibrations, their lungs learned to store more oxygen for deep dives, and their metabolism adjusted to the chill of the sea. Bit by bit, the ocean remade them. By the middle of the Paleogene, the transformation was complete enough that no one would have called them land animals anymore. Among the most impressive of these new ocean dwellers was Basilosaurus, whose name, amusingly, means king lizard. Early scientists thought it was a reptile because of its long, sinuous body, but Basilosaurus was all mammal, and it was magnificent. Stretching up to 18 meters long, it ruled the Eocene seas like a living ship, long and serpentine, with jaws that could crush anything foolish enough to cross its path. Its teeth were sharp and uneven, cutting blades in front, crushing molars in back, perfect tools for a predator that didn't discriminate. Fish, sharks, other marine mammals, it ate them all. Its skull alone could reach over a meter in length. Armed with teeth that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of engineers and sadists. When Basilosaurus bit, the ocean listened. But for all its monstrous size, it still carried traces of its past life on land. Hidden beneath its body, near the tail, were tiny hind legs, vestigial relics, useless for walking but still there, like whispers from another world. Each one was only about the size of a human hand, with a few delicate toes. No one knows exactly why they lingered. Perhaps they helped during mating. Perhaps they were just evolutionary leftovers. Either way, they told a story written in bone. Once upon a time, this giant swam with the memory of walking. Watching Basilosaurus move would have been hypnotic. Its body undulated like a ribbon, flexible and fluid. Unlike modern whales, which power themselves with muscular tails moving up and down, Basilosaurus swam more like an eel, writhing side to side through the currents. It was fast, efficient, and slightly terrifying. Imagine standing on a Paleogene beach and seeing that long shadow sliding beneath the waves, surfacing only briefly for air before vanishing again into the deep. The sea had found its new monarch, and Basilosaurus wasn't alone. The oceans of the Paleogene were full of its kin, an entire family of evolving forms, each testing different versions of aquatic life. There were sleek hunters like Dorodon, smaller than Basilosaurus but built with similar grace, perhaps even its prey at times. There were Protocetus and Rodhocetus, more amphibious, still clumsy on land but capable swimmers. Some retained webbed feet. Others had tails growing more muscular by the generation. The transition from land to sea wasn't a single leap. It was a series of experiments, nature's long, patient rehearsal for perfection. In those ancient waters, the rules of life were rewriting themselves. Mammals had become fish-shaped without becoming fish. They still breathed air, still nursed their young, still carried warm blood through their veins, but they had swapped paws for flippers, fur for blubber, and gravity for buoyancy. Their world was now one of currents, sound, and pressure. Down in the depths, where light faded into darkness, they hunted by vibration and instinct, guided by inner compasses more ancient than thought. The Paleogene oceans themselves were changing too. The continents were drifting toward their modern positions, reshaping coastlines and redirecting currents. The Antarctic circumpolar current began spinning around the southern pole, cooling the waters and setting up the temperature gradients that still drive the planet's climate today. Warm equatorial seas teemed with plankton and small fish. Cooler regions nurtured new species of squid and early sharks. The stage was rich, the cast expanding, and the whales were fast becoming its stars. To breathe, they had to surface, of course, but even that became a kind of ritual. A sleek body rising through the water, a burst of air and mist exploding into sunlight. Then the slow, graceful descent again. It was breath turned into poetry. In that momentary meeting of sea and sky, you could almost imagine the planet exhaling with them, as if saying, "Welcome home." Their dives grew deeper over time. The physics of pressure and darkness didn't deter them. It fascinated them. They learned to slow their heartbeats, to collapse their lungs safely, to let oxygen saturate their blood and muscles for minutes, even hours. Down there, where sunlight couldn't reach, Basilosaurus and its kin hunted by touch and sound, navigating a liquid night. The ocean's silence wasn't empty. It was alive with low rumbles and distant clicks. The early beginnings of the complex acoustic world whales still use today. It's hard not to admire the audacity of it all. Life had climbed from the sea to the land, at unimaginable cost, building bones and lungs and legs to escape the water's pull. And now, here were its descendants, happily undoing all that work, slipping back beneath the waves with smug satisfaction. The Earth, amused as always, didn't mind. Evolution isn't about direction, it's about opportunity. If there's an empty niche, something will find a way to fill it. The whales filled it. Magnificently, they became the architects of the marine ecosystem, shaping food webs and moving nutrients between surface and deep. Every dive stirred the water, every exhalation fed the plankton with iron-rich particles. Even in death, their bodies sank to the seafloor, feeding entire communities of scavengers for decades. The sea had given them life again, and they gave it structure in return. There's a quiet comedy in imagining that somewhere on land, a distant cousin of Basilosaurus, a grazing mammal with hooves, might have looked out at the ocean, wondering what became of those relatives who never came back. If whales could laugh, they might have answered from beneath the waves, "We're doing just fine, thank you." The Paleogene seas, once ruled by reptiles and then emptied by extinction, now thrummed with mammalian energy. You could have swum in warm equatorial shallows and seen Dorodon dart past like a living torpedo, while Basilosaurus glided through deeper waters like a shadow of time itself. Schools of fish shimmered in their wake, unaware that these creatures were not just predators, they were history in motion, carrying the legacy of land animals into a new dimension. In a way, the story of ancient whales is the story of transformation itself, the courage or perhaps the stubbornness to change everything and start over. They didn't abandon their past, they reshaped it. Their bones still carried echoes of feet, their movements still hinted at walking. Evolution never erases, it repurposes. A leg becomes a fin, a nostril becomes a blowhole, and the memory of land becomes instinct for surfacing. As the Paleogene drew on, the oceans grew deeper and colder, and these early whales continued to evolve, refining their designs. Their descendants would eventually develop echolocation, baleen filters, and complex social behaviors. But in this ancient chapter, they were still wild and experimental, half myth, half prototype. The sea was their forge, and every tide shaped them a little more into the masters of water they would become. And so, the mammals who once scurried through forests found themselves chasing fish across continents of blue. They had left behind the weight of gravity, the roughness of soil, the limitations of land. In the water they could grow vast, move effortlessly, and explore dimensions no hoof or paw could reach. Imagine the sunset over a Paleogene ocean, the sky painted orange and violet, the waves rolling with a slow rhythm, and in the distance a massive shape breaches the surface. A column of spray rises into the air, glittering in the light. For a moment the creature hovers between worlds, part of the sea, touching the sky, and then it slides back down with a thunderous splash. The ripples spread wide, fading into calm. The ocean, newly alive, reflects the last light of day. From land to sea, from legs to fins, from lungs to song, the journey had come full circle. The whales had returned home, not as refugees but as rulers. The Paleogene oceans had a new sovereign, long and elegant, and breathing air, and if the earth could speak it might have murmured with quiet pride, "You remembered how to swim." The world had changed beyond recognition since the age of dinosaurs, but the lesson remained the same. Life adapts, life explores, life never stops moving. In the deep blue theatres of the Paleogene seas, that truth shimmered in every ripple, every shadow, every dive. The mammals had claimed the land, but the whales had claimed forever. The Paleogene forests were alive again, green, dense, and humming with possibility. Sunlight filtered through the leaves like liquid gold, dappling the ground where roots tangled and insects hummed. Among the branches, something small and lively moved. A flicker of fur, a quick leap, a curious pause. It wasn't the largest creature in the forest or the fastest or the fiercest, but it was about to do something no giant had ever done. It was going to think. Meet Paleodippus, one of the earliest known primates, or at least something very close. It lived about 55 million years ago, during the late Paleocene and early Eocene, in forests that stretched across what are now North America and Europe. At first glance, it didn't look particularly remarkable. About the size of a squirrel, with soft fur, grasping hands, and a long tail for balance, Paleodippus could easily have passed for an over-caffeinated tree mammal, just trying to make it through the day. But behind its bright eyes, something was changing. Its brain was growing, reorganizing, experimenting with new possibilities. The first whispers of intelligence were taking shape. The Earth, always fond of second chances, had rebuilt its forests after the Great Extinction. The canopies were thick, the air warm and damp, the trees dripping with fruit, leaves, and life. In this green labyrinth, creatures that could climb, grasp, and judge distance had an edge. The ground was dangerous, home to larger mammals and sudden predators. The air was crowded with birds. But the trees offered food, safety, and adventure for anyone nimble enough to master them. Paleodippus was built for this vertical world. Its fingers were long and flexible, tipped with nails instead of claws, a small change, but an evolutionary breakthrough. Nails allowed for precision, for controlled gripping and manipulation. With them came the ability to handle fruit, peel bark, or pick at insects. Those nimble hands were the beginning of curiosity made physical. Its feet were just as clever, with opposable toes that could grasp branches as easily as fingers. It could hang, swing, leap, and twist through the trees, with an ease that would make later monkeys proud. Every day was an acrobatic performance. Climb up to the canopy for breakfast, leap to the next tree for lunch, dodge a falling branch or a hungry owl, and find a cozy nook to sleep in before nightfall. Balance and coordination weren't just useful, they were survival. And then there were the eyes. Positioned at the front of the head, they offered Plesiadapis, something few other mammals had: depth perception. Two overlapping fields of vision merged into a single three-dimensional view of the world. It could judge how far the next branch was before leaping. It could track the movement of fruit swaying in the wind, or the flick of an insect's wing. This was 3D vision, the kind we take for granted when catching a ball or driving a car. But in the Paleogene, it was revolutionary. That ability to see the world in layers of depth changed everything. It meant Plesiadapids could move with precision, plan its leaps, and perhaps even anticipate what might happen next. The seeds of foresight were being planted, and somewhere in its small brain, a few more neurons began talking to each other, laying down the first faint circuits of what would one day become imagination. Of course, Plesiadapis wasn't pondering philosophy. It was far too busy surviving, sniffing out ripe fruit, cracking open seeds, and dodging whatever else called the forest home. But its behavior hinted at something new: adaptability, not just in body, but in mind. It could learn, remember, and even solve simple problems. Where others relied solely on instinct, it was beginning to rely on awareness. Evolution was quietly wiring curiosity into the primate brain. Its diet reflected that flexibility. Plesiadapis was an omnivore, eating fruit, leaves, insects, and maybe the occasional small vertebrate. The forest provided a buffet, and Plesiadapis took full advantage of it. Sharp front teeth for biting, flat molars for grinding. It was equipped for culinary improvisation. Every meal was an experiment, every taste a new lesson in survival. In a way, the birth of intelligence began with snack. The brain of Plesiadapis, while still small, was proportionally larger than those of most mammals around it. Its sensory regions, especially those for vision and touch, were expanding. You could say evolution was running a beta test of what would later become the primate mind, alert, curious, and endlessly interested in its surroundings. It wasn't self-aware yet, but it was getting close. The forests where it lived were lush but unpredictable. Climate fluctuations during the Paleogene could turn regions from tropical to temperate within a few million years. A blink in geological time, for creatures like Plesiadapis, that instability was a challenge and a teacher. To survive, it had to adapt, not just physically but behaviorally. The animals that could think fast, find new food sources, learn new paths, remember where fruit ripened, were the ones that thrived. Intelligence, it turns out, was evolution's answer to chaos. Watching Plesiadapis in its leafy world would have been both charming and enlightening. You might see one pause on a branch, tilting its head, studying a cluster of berries as if calculating whether the branch could hold its weight. Then, with a twitch of its tail, it would leap, catch the branch mid-air, and hang upside down, chewing contentedly while the forest shimmered with sound around it. Its every move was a blend of instinct and decision. Somewhere deep in its brain, neurons fired in new patterns, tiny sparks of awareness in a mammal still ruled by reflex. It's easy to imagine the forest as a training ground for intelligence. Every branch was a test of balance. Every rustle, a potential danger. Every shadow, a puzzle to solve. Living among the trees demanded constant attention and adaptability. You couldn't just lumber through it. You had to think your way around it. The forest was a classroom, and Plesiadapis was one of its earliest students. Humor helps too. You can almost picture a young Plesiadapis misjudging a jump, slipping and catching itself by the tail, hanging there for a few seconds in indignity before scrambling back up. Evolution is patient, but not always graceful. Every mistake was a lesson, every bruise a step toward better judgment. Intelligence, like balance, is learned through falling. While Plesiadapis and its relatives were perfecting the art of arboreal living, evolution was already busy sketching new variations. Some primates would grow larger, their eyes bigger, their brains more complex. Others would develop better grip strength or keener sense. The Paleogene forests became laboratories of cognition, filled with experiments in dexterity and perception. From these branches of possibility would eventually come monkeys, apes, and much, much later us. What's remarkable about these early primates isn't how different they were from us, but how familiar they already seem. Their curiosity, their social tendencies, their adaptability, all of it feels like a preview. The way they explored, interacted, and problem-solved was the prototype of human behavior, just scaled down and fur-covered. You could say that the spark of human intelligence was first kindled in those Paleogene treetops, flickering quietly between leaves. The expansion of the primate brain wasn't just about size, it was about connection. Neurons formed dense networks, communication between brain regions increased, and sensory input became more integrated. Vision linked with touch, movement with planning, experience with memory. The animal could now not only react to the world, but predict it. In evolutionary terms, that was revolutionary. And with that came emotion, rudimentary at first, but unmistakable. Playfulness, caution, affection, fear. The palette of mammalian feelings that would one day paint human consciousness began with creatures like this. A mother Plesiadapis grooming her young, a pair wrestling in the branches, a startled cry at a snapping twig, all were small expressions of a mind learning to feel as well as to think. Climate continued its unpredictable dance throughout the Paleogene. Heat waves, cool spells, shifting rainfall, all reshaped the forests and forced their inhabitants to stay sharp. Every generation faced a slightly different world, and those who could think creatively about it had the upper hand. Over millions of years, that creative edge became instinct itself. Problem-solving became survival. Curiosity became code. By the end of the Paleogene, the descendants of Plesiadapis had diversified into a range of true primates, early prosimians with grasping hands, forward-facing eyes, and brains that were beginning to look suspiciously human in proportion. They moved in small groups, social and communicative, their calls echoing through the canopy. They had discovered something far more powerful than claws or fangs: cooperation. Intelligence was no longer just individual, it was shared. And yet it all started with something small, quick, and slightly clumsy, leaping between the trees 55 million years ago. A creature that never knew it was paving the way for philosophy, architecture, or space travel. All it wanted was to reach the next branch and the next meal, but in doing so it was shaping the destiny of thought itself. If the earth could have spoken then, it might have whispered, "Think," not as an order, but as an invitation. And the little primates, blinking their bright forward-facing eyes, accepted. They began to see their world not just as a backdrop for survival, but as a puzzle to be understood. That spark of curiosity flickering in the forest shadows of the Paleogene would never go out. It would grow, evolve, and eventually look back through time, trying to remember where it began. The answer, as always, would be found in the trees, in the small, clever hands of creatures like Plesiadapis, who took the first leap not just toward another branch, but toward awareness itself. So if you ever feel proud of human intelligence, remember, it all started with something small, fuzzy, and probably covered in tree sap, squinting through the leaves with the first 3D vision in history. From there, the universe would never look the same again. The Paleogene world was a stage of experimentation. The Earth, still restless after its rebirth, seemed to be in one of its wild moods, throwing ideas at evolution like an artist with too much paint and not enough patience. Some of those ideas would stick, some would vanish, and a few would become downright strange. And nowhere was that creative chaos more thrilling than in the realm of predators. When the dinosaurs vanished, they left behind not just bones and legends, but a vacancy, the most coveted role in nature's play, the apex predator. For tens of millions of years, the world's food chains had been ruled by reptiles, with teeth the size of knives and appetites to match. When they were gone, the earth didn't pause for long. Something had to fill the void. Something had to hunt. At first, the competition was open. The mammals were still small and figuring out what to do with their new freedom. Reptiles had retreated to the swamps and rivers, leaving land mostly unclaimed. And so, for a strange and fleeting moment in history, the skies themselves took over. Out of the forests of early Europe and North America came one of evolution's boldest prototypes, Gastornis, the giant flightless bird. Now, calling Gastornis a bird doesn't quite prepare you for meeting one. This creature stood over 2 meters tall, roughly the height of a basketball player, but heavier, thicker, and equipped with a beak that could crush bone. It had long, muscular legs, feathered but useless for flight, and wings reduced to small, stubby appendages. Its head was enormous, a solid wedge of muscle and keratin, ending in a curved beak like a living battle axe. If you saw one striding through a Paleogene forest, you might have mistaken it for a small dinosaur that missed the memo about extinction. For a long time, paleontologists argued about whether Gastornis was truly a predator. Some insisted it was a herbivore, using its massive beak to crack seeds or tear tough plants. Others, looking at those jaws and the terrifying structure of its skull, saw something more sinister. Modern analysis suggests that while it may have eaten plants occasionally, Gastornis had all the hardware of a hunter, or at least an opportunistic omnivore with attitude. Its beak could easily crush small animals, and its size alone made it the undisputed boss of its environment. Imagine one lurking in the early morning fog, massive claws sinking into damp soil, head tilting as it listens for movement. Then, with startling speed, it lunges. A single strike of that beak, and the forest goes silent again. Whether it chased prey or simply ambushed it doesn't matter much. Either way, it was terrifyingly effective, and in the Paleogene terror was a competitive advantage. The giant birds weren't alone in their ambitions. Elsewhere, evolution was running a very different experiment, on 4 legs instead of 2, with fur instead of feathers. Enter the creodonts, one of the strangest and most formidable lineages of ancient carnivorous mammals. Before modern carnivores like cats, dogs, and bears rose to power, creodonts were the undisputed top predators on land for millions of years. They were the warm-blooded heirs to the hunting throne. If you saw a creodont today, you might not immediately know what you were looking at. They came in many shapes and sizes, some small and lithe like civets, others enormous and hulking like bears, but all of them shared one terrifying feature: jaws designed for annihilation. Their skulls were long, their teeth interlocking like serrated scissors, and their jaw muscles so powerful that scientists say they could crush bone with ease. Imagine the bite force of a modern lion, then multiply it. Creodonts didn't just eat meat, they engineered it into dust. One of the most famous was Hyenodon, whose name, fittingly, means hyena tooth. It wasn't actually related to hyenas, but the resemblance was uncanny. Massive jaws, thick neck, and a face that looked built to ruin someone's day. Some species were the size of wolves, others grew larger than modern big cats. They hunted across plains and forests, using keen senses of smell and vision to track prey. Their skulls were long and narrow, giving them an honest reptilian appearance, a nod perhaps to the predators that came before. Where Gastornis relied on speed and brute force, creodonts perfected precision and endurance. They could chase, stalk, and ambush. Their teeth, called carnassials, fit together like blades in a pair of shears, slicing meat efficiently. They were not subtle animals. They were walking, growling, bone-grinding solutions to hunger. But what made this era so fascinating was how different the rules of survival had become. In the Mesozoic, dominance was about size and armor. In the Paleogene, it was about adaptation and imagination. The hunters of this new world weren't standardized killing machines. They were improvisations. The Earth seemed to be testing what a predator could be. In South America, large flightless birds known as terror birds would later follow in Gastornis's footsteps, turning the role of top predator into an avian experiment. But even in the Paleogene, you can see the idea taking shape. Nature was exploring the physics of predation in every possible direction on land and air, even at the edges of water. It was as if the planet had decided to audition different designs for hunter, just to see what worked. And while many of those designs didn't last, the creativity was astonishing. There were nimble, cat-like creodonts darting between trees. There were squat, bear-sized species lumbering through the grasslands. Some hunted alone, others perhaps cooperatively. They ruled for almost 30 million years, a reign longer than humans have existed, and for a time they were everything from wolves to lions, before wolves and lions were even ideas in evolution's mind. The world they lived in was perfect for their rise. The Paleogene climate swung between warmth and chill, forests expanding and contracting with each pulse. In warm periods, lush jungles returned, teeming with prey. In cooler times, open plains offered room to chase. Every shift in temperature was another invitation for adaptation. Creodonts thrived in both, shaping themselves to whatever the world offered. Meanwhile, Gastornis and its feathered kin stalked the edges of rivers and meadows, owning the daylight hours. Imagine the eerie silence of a Paleogene dawn, then the rhythmic thud of enormous bird feet through the mist. A family of small mammals freezes, every whisker alert. Then the sound stops, only the dripping of water from leaves. And then a flash of feathers, a sharp crack of beak against bone, and breakfast is served. If this sounds brutal, well, it was. The Paleogene food web was not for the sentimental, but it was also strangely beautiful, a period when the planet was still trying to figure out how to balance intelligence, power, and survival. There was art in its violence, precision in its chaos. Every kill, every chase, every crunch of bone was part of the grand rehearsal for the ecosystems we know today. Even among predators, evolution kept experimenting. Some creodonts began to specialize, their teeth narrowing for slicing, their limbs elongating for speed. Others bulked up, relying on brute strength. But nature rarely allows monopolies. As the Eocene gave way to the Oligocene, new carnivorous mammals began to appear, the ancestors of modern cats and dogs. They were lighter, quicker, and more efficient. Slowly, competition crept in. The creodonts didn't vanish overnight, but the stage they had dominated began to fill with new actors. Still, for millions of years, they were kings, and very strange kings at that. Their eyes faced forward, their nostrils wide, their skulls thick and heavy. They were products of a world still finding balance, still shaking off its post-extinction hangover. And yet, they thrived. For every misstep, evolution had a success story waiting nearby. What makes the Paleogene so thrilling isn't just the creatures themselves, but the sense that the Earth was still improvising. It had lost its great reptiles and was trying to figure out what a mammalian world should look like. Should the new hunters have feathers, fur, 2 legs or 4, beaks, or teeth? The answer, apparently, was all of the above. If you were to wander through a Paleogene forest, you'd see that strange variety everywhere. A feathered giant staring you down with eyes like coins, a furry predator skulking between shadows, tail low, breath steaming in the cool morning air. The air would smell of sap, blood, and wet leaves. Every sound, a rustle, a snap, a call, could mean life or death. It was the world's first mammalian thriller, written in tooth and claw, and through it all, the Earth seemed to whisper its favorite mantra, adapt or perish. The hunters heard it loud and clear. Gastornis turned its wings into balance poles. Creodonts turned their jaws into precision tools. Each found its place in the great experiment of the Paleogene, proving that survival could take almost any shape. Looking back, it's hard not to smile at the audacity of it all. A 2-meter-tall bird stalking the forests like a feathered nightmare, and a lineage of mammals that could chew through bone for fun. What a strange, bold world that must have been. And yet, out of that chaos came the blueprint for modern ecosystems, where birds and mammals still share the ancient legacy of those early hunters. The Paleogene was a time of predators unlike any before or since. Some were elegant, others absurd, all of them necessary. They were the Earth's way of testing the boundaries of what life could be. And if you listen closely through the fossil record and the echoes of time, you can almost hear it still. The faint thud of a giant bird's stride, the crunch of bone beneath a creodont's jaw, and the planet's quiet approving murmur. Yes, this will do. There was a time when the Earth was almost entirely covered in forests. Trees ruled the landscape, from the humid tropics to the cool temperate zones, their roots threading through the soil like veins, their canopies catching the sun in wide, leafy hands. But then, slowly, quietly, something new began to spread. a plant so unassuming it didn't even bother to grow tall. It hugged the ground, crept outward, and multiplied with the patience of time itself. It was grass, and it was about to change the planet forever. Didn't look like much in the beginning, just simple, flexible blades waving in the Paleogene wind. But evolution is rarely impressed by size or drama. Sometimes the smallest innovations reshape everything. Grass wasn't flashy, it was revolutionary. It had found a new way to live, to grow, to endure. And once it started, it never stopped. Imagine the world around 35 million years ago, during the late Eocene and early Oligocene. The climate was cooling, forests were retreating, and open spaces began to appear where dense canopies once stood. These clearings were harsh, sun-baked, windy, dry. Trees struggled to hold their ground, their roots cracking through parched soil. But the grasses, they loved it. This was their moment. Grass has a secret weapon, silica. Each blade is infused with microscopic grains of this glass-like mineral, making it tough, resistant, and let's be honest, terrible to chew. For most plants, being eaten is a design flaw. For grass, it's part of the plan. When grazers bite it down, it simply grows back. Its growth points are near the base, not the tip, meaning that a hungry mouth doesn't end its life. It trims it, encourages it. Grass was evolution's answer to being devoured. Go ahead, I'll just keep growing. And so it did. The Paleogene saw the slow, unstoppable march of green across continents. Patches of grasslands expanded into meadows, then into endless seas of waving blades. The forests that had once dominated began to break apart, their trees retreating into belts near rivers and wetter regions. The earth was opening up, flattening out, and breathing differently. Where once there had been shade and shadow, now there was light, space, and wind. The arrival of grass wasn't just a change in scenery, it was a revolution in how life worked. Entire food webs restructured themselves around this new resource. Before grass, most herbivores were browsers, nibbling on leaves, fruit and shoots from trees and shrubs. But on the new plains, the food was low, tough, and plentiful. All you had to do was lower your head and keep eating. That's exactly what mammals began to do. Evolution went to work again, reshaping mouths, teeth, and stomachs. The first grazers appeared, creatures that could handle the constant grind of grass eating without wearing their teeth to stub. Their molars grew broader and flatter, their enamel thicker, their jaws stronger. Some developed ever-growing teeth, like natural conveyor belts of dentin and enamel, always ready for another bite. Digesting grass wasn't easy either. It's full of cellulose, a carbohydrate that most animals can't break down on their own. So herbivores struck a deal with microbes, tiny symbiotic bacteria living inside their stomachs that could turn that tough cellulose into usable energy. The result was a digestive arms race, stomachs with chambers, fermentation vats, and endless burping. The air of the Paleogene might have smelled a little rich, but it was the scent of progress, and as the grazers multiplied, the landscape itself changed. Their hooves and footsteps churned the soil, spreading seeds and mixing nutrients. Their droppings fertilized the ground, feeding more grass. The relationship between plant and herbivore became a feedback loop of abundance. Grasslands fed animals, animals fed the land, and the land grew even more grass. The earth was reinventing fertility. From a distance, these new grasslands would have been breathtaking. Imagine an early Oligocene morning, a vast plain stretching to the horizon, silver with dew. Herds of small and large mammals graze in the mist, some low to the ground, nibbling delicately. Others tall and broad-backed, sweeping their muzzles from side to side like living harvesters. The wind ripples through the blades like waves, and the sunlight glitters off the silica, turning the ground into a sea of green fire. It's easy to forget how radical this transformation was. The dominance of grass redefined not just who ate what, but how animals lived, moved, and behaved. Herds replaced solitary foragers. Migration became a way of life. In forests, animals could hide. In open grasslands, the only defense was vigilance and speed. Evolution, ever pragmatic, took note. Eyes moved to the sides of heads for wider vision. Legs lengthened for running. Herd instincts sharpened, turning individual fear into collective safety. Even predators, those who relied on herbivores for food, had to adapt to this new world. The forests had favored ambush hunters, silent stalkers, leaping from cover, but the grasslands demanded something else: endurance, coordination, and speed. The chase became an art form, the whole dynamic of life tilted, all because of a plant barely ankle-high. Grass didn't stop there, though. It began to diversify into countless species, each fine-tuned to a particular climate or soil. Some thrived in hot savannas, others in cool steppe regions. Some spread by seeds, others by underground runners, weaving invisible networks through the soil. It was a quiet, patient conquest. No explosions, no noise, just endless, tireless growth. It also changed the planet itself in ways few other organisms ever have. Grasses altered the carbon cycle by drawing huge amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it underground in their roots. Those roots held soil together, preventing erosion, stabilizing the ground against floods and droughts. In essence, grass became the planet's green armor, soft to the touch but strong enough to shape entire continents. Scientists sometimes call the rise of grass one of the most important evolutionary events since photosynthesis. It sounds dramatic, but they're not wrong. With grass came a new kind of stability and resilience. Ecosystems built around it were incredibly productive and adaptable. Even as climates shifted, grasslands could regenerate quickly, recover from fires, and keep the food web alive. And speaking of fire, grass had another surprising relationship with it. Unlike most plants, grass actually benefited from burning. Its roots, buried deep underground, survived flames that scorched everything above. After a wildfire, grass was often the first to return, sprouting green against the blackened earth. In time, it even encouraged fires, feeding them with its dry blades. The more it burned, the more space it cleared for itself. Evolution had found a way to turn destruction into opportunity. This new world of grass brought with it a symphony of motion. The ground trembled with the passage of herds, each species finding its rhythm in the vastness. You could have stood in the middle of a Paleogene plain and felt the vibration under your feet, the pulsing life of thousands of hooves, the wind whispering through the blades, the faint hum of insects weaving through the stalks. The earth itself seemed to breathe differently, slower, steadier, confident in its new green skin. For the first time since the dinosaurs, the planet had achieved something like ecological balance. The grasslands supported enormous populations of animals, from the tiniest burrowers to towering herbivores. They created diversity through abundance, a banquet that fed evolution itself. Wherever grass spread, life followed. Even the sky began to change. Insects adapted to the new plants, spawning vast numbers of grasshoppers and crickets. Birds, in turn, evolved to feed on them, filling the air with fluttering wings and echoing calls. The Paleogene plains were alive in every direction, up, down, and sideways, a mosaic of movement stitched together by grass. But perhaps the most astonishing thing about this transformation was how quiet it was. No cataclysm, no meteor, no dramatic upheaval, just the steady patience of photosynthesis and sunlight. In a few million years, grass had turned the face of the planet into something utterly new. If you could listen closely, you might imagine the earth itself whispering during this time, "Grow." And the grasses obeyed. They spread in every direction, over hills and valleys, across continents and coasts. They climbed highlands and slipped into river deltas. They didn't conquer through force, but through persistence. Humorously enough, for all its power, grass was humble. It didn't tower or roar or sparkle. It bent in the wind, let itself be eaten, burned and trampled. And yet, it always returned. It was resilience made visible. If the dinosaurs had been Earth's drama, grass was its quiet wisdom. And with it came a new kind of beauty, the minimalist kind. The forest had been intricate, layered, mysterious. The grasslands were open, honest and vast. They invited the eye to wander, the legs to move, the imagination to expand. Life began to run, to roam, to live at scale. By the end of the Paleogene, the world had transformed. Forests still existed, yes, but the open plains had taken their place, as the dominant landscape in many regions. The age of grass had begun, and with it, the blueprint for the modern world was set in motion. The endless dance of grazers and hunters, roots and rainfall, carbon and air, all from a plant that simply refused to stop growing. If you could stand there, in that ancient wind, with blades brushing your ankles and herds stretching to the horizon, you might feel it, the pulse of something both gentle and unstoppable. The earth had reinvented life again, this time not through fire or fury, but through patience and persistence. The grasses had come, and they were here to stay. The earth never sits still. Beneath our feet it shifts, shudders, and sighs like a living thing, dreaming in its sleep. Even when the surface looks calm, oceans glittering, mountains stoic, continents quiet, deep below the planet's crust is drifting, folding and colliding in a slow, unstoppable ballet. During the Paleogene period, roughly 66 to 23 million years ago, that dance was particularly dramatic. The stage that would become our modern world was still under construction, its scenery rearranging, its actors learning their mark. Mountains were born, oceans redrew their borders, and the climate, forever sensitive to geography's whims, responded with thunderous mood swings. In the aftermath of the dinosaurs' extinction, the continents were already in motion, sliding across the planet's molten mantle at about the speed your fingernails grow. Slow to us, yes, but over millions of years, those centimeters add up to revolutions. North America and Eurasia were drifting apart, widening the Atlantic Ocean that had first opened like a crack in the Jurassic. Africa, restless as ever, was drifting northward, heading for a collision that would one day ripple across half the planet. India, a runaway continent speeding north like a tectonic bullet, was closing in on Asia, bringing with it the promise of mountains no human eye would ever see for another 60 million years. And then collisions began. When continents meet, they don't politely shake hands, they crumple. Around 40 million years ago, the Indian plate slammed into Asia with the force of geological destiny. The crust buckled and folded, thrust upward layer by layer until the Himalayas began to rise, a jagged scar of stone reaching for the heavens. Even now they're still growing, a few millimeters higher every year, a monument to that ancient impact. Farther west, another collision was underway, Africa grinding into Eurasia, pushing up a range that would become the Alps. What we now call Switzerland was once the site of colossal tectonic violence, a slow-motion car crash between continents, leaving behind the magnificent mountains where snow and rock still bear witness to that Paleogene struggle. To the south, meanwhile, a lonely continent was drifting toward isolation. Antarctica, once connected to Australia and South America, began to pull away. At first, the separation was gentle, just a few shallow seas opening between them. But as the gap widened, something extraordinary happened. Around 34 million years ago, ocean currents found their way through the space between these continents and began to circle around the South Pole, that endless ring of cold water. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current would become one of the most powerful systems on Earth. It spun like a liquid fortress around Antarctica, cutting it off from warm northern waters and plunging it into cold. The ice began to grow. For the first time in tens of millions of years, the southern pole froze, transforming the global climate. The Paleogene greenhouse world was giving way to something new, a cooler, more temperate planet. The effects rippled everywhere. Ocean currents shifted, rainfall patterns changed, and ecosystems scrambled to adapt. The tropical warmth of the early Paleogene gave way to more pronounced seasons. Deserts spread in some areas, while others became cooler and wetter. The world was learning the rhythm of climate cycles, the alternation of warmth and chill that would define the coming epochs. And at the heart of it all was geography, the slow, grinding movement of continents sculpting the breath of the planet. Even as some regions froze, others burned with new activity. Volcanic arcs flared where plates collided, spewing minerals and gases that fed both the atmosphere and the soil. The ring of fire, that restless chain around the Pacific, was already alive with eruptions. In the Atlantic, the mid-ocean ridge hummed quietly, pushing seafloor outward like a geological conveyor belt. The Earth was rebuilding itself, bit by bit, with fire and pressure as its tools. But the shifting continents didn't just shape the land, they shaped life itself. Every collision or drift created new coastlines, new climates, and new migration routes. When the continents touch, they form bridges. When they pull apart, they create isolation. Both are powerful forces in evolution's story. Take the Bering Land Bridge, for example, the ancient connection between Asia and North America. During parts of the Paleogene, sea levels dropped enough for a corridor of dry land to emerge across what is now the Bering Strait. It wasn't grand or glamorous, but for animals it was a lifeline. Species wandered back and forth, mammals, birds, insects, spreading across continents that had once been strangers. It was a slow-motion migration festival that shaped the gene pools of both hemispheres. Somewhere on that icy passage, ancient hoofed mammals crossed from Asia into the Americas, unknowingly setting the stage for future giants. Farther south, another crucial connection was forming, or rather reforming. Between North and South America lay a chain of islands and shallow seas that would much later rise to become the Isthmus of Panama. During the Paleogene, it wasn't yet complete, but even temporary land bridges allowed species to wander and mingle. The ancestors of future tapirs, sloths, and armadillos likely made their early journeys here, testing the edges of what would one day become a crucial gateway between oceans and continents. And as the continents connected and separated, ocean currents followed suit. Geography dictates water's path, and water dictates climate. The closure of ancient seaways redirected heat across the globe like a planetary thermostat. The Arctic was still relatively mild during much of the Paleogene, with swamps and forests growing near its shores, but by the epic's end, the poles had begun to define themselves, cold in the south, cooling in the north, the first whispers of ice ages to come. The changes weren't uniform, though. Africa, for example, was still mostly tropical, with lush forests and wide rivers. It was slowly drifting closer to Eurasia, but the connection wouldn't fully form until the next epoch. Australia, freed from its southern ties, drifted northward into warmer waters, carrying its unique cargo of marsupials and monotremmes, life that would evolve in splendid isolation. South America, too, remained its own experiment, a world of strange, self-contained evolution, where terror birds, giant rodents, and peculiar hoofed mammals ruled the plains. Everywhere you looked, the world was dynamic. Mountains grew where none had stood before. Oceans deepened, islands rose and sank. Rivers carved new paths, draining into newly formed basins. Even the air above changed. As mountains rose, they altered wind currents and rainfall, creating rain shadows and deserts on their leeward sides. The Himalayas, in particular, began to influence the global climate by diverting monsoons and drawing down carbon dioxide as weathering increased on their freshly exposed rock faces. Geography was not just shaping landscapes, it was sculpting the atmosphere itself. To imagine the Paleogene Earth is to imagine motion made visible. Picture continents as enormous rafts drifting across a vast, restless ocean, bumping, scraping, and sliding past one another. Picture volcanoes along the edges of these rafts, marking the lines where they collide. Picture currents spinning through new channels, carrying heat and life between hemispheres. It's a planetary waltz that never stops, even now. And it wasn't just physics at play, it was destiny. Every tectonic shove laid the groundwork for future ecosystems. When Antarctica froze, it cooled the oceans, setting in motion the climate that would later favor grasslands. When India collided with Asia, it not only built mountains, but also influenced global rainfall, nurturing the monsoon systems that still sustain billions of lives today. The continents weren't just drifting, they were writing the future. If you could have looked down on Earth from space during the Paleogene, you might not have recognized it, but you'd see hints of what was coming. North and South America were separated by narrow seas, but edging closer together. Africa was rising toward Europe, its northern edge already brushing against the Mediterranean. Eurasia stretched wide and green, mountains fringing its southern rim. Australia was an island heading north like a lone traveler. Antarctica, newly frozen, gleamed white against a darkening ocean. The planet was rearranging itself into the form we now call home. And through it all, the Earth remained busy, endlessly busy. Every earthquake, every mountain uplift, every shift in sea level echoed through ecosystems, A new mountain range meant new rainfall patterns. A new strait meant new ocean current. A land bridge meant a burst of migration, followed by isolation and evolution. Geography and biology were dancing partners, each guiding the other through the slow music of time. It's tempting to imagine the continents as static puzzles, but they're more like restless animals, creatures with their own moods and destinies. During the Paleogene, they were particularly energetic, exploring new positions, testing new alignments. The world didn't just change, it practiced changing over and over, refining itself. There's humor in it too, if you think about it. Imagine the continents as characters in a long-running play, India rushing in dramatically from the south, slamming into Asia and shouting, "I've arrived." Africa sidling toward Europe, muttering, "Mind if I squeeze in?" Antarctica quietly spinning away, saying nothing but freezing everything in sight. And the oceans, patient as ever, swirling around their antics, sighing, "Here we go again." By the end of the Paleogene, the Earth had settled into something resembling its modern layout. Not finished, never finished, but recognizable. The great collisions had carved mountains that would define weather and culture alike. The ocean currents had set the rhythm of climate. The land bridges had woven continents into a single, interconnected web of life. The world was smaller now, more cohesive, more familiar, and yet it was still full of movement. The plates kept drifting, the mountains kept rising. The planet kept breathing, its crust stretching and folding like the surface of a living organism. The Earth doesn't stop. It only pauses between tremors. So when you look at a map today, remember those shapes are temporary. The continents we know are mid-step in a dance that began long before us and will continue long after. During the Paleogene, they spun, collided and reshaped the face of the Earth, turning chaos into continents, heat into wind and ocean into ice. If the planet could speak, it might have murmured then, as it still does now, "Move," and everything did. The mountains rose, the seas deepened, the air shifted, and life followed. The Earth was never still, never finished, never bored. The Paleogene was its masterpiece of motion, a world remade, not in fire or flood, but in patience. Continents wandered, climates turned, and the stage for the modern world was set. The map of life itself had been redrawn, and beneath it all, the planet hummed its eternal refrain, "Change is the only constant. Don't stand still. The ground is moving." If the Earth could speak, and perhaps it does in wind and water, it would tell us that change is nothing new. The Paleogene period, with its volcanoes, its shifting continents, its boiling heat waves and sudden chills, already lived through the kind of transformations that we now fear. It watched entire ecosystems vanish, then rise again in different forms. It witnessed the birth of mountains, the cooling of oceans, and the dawn of new species who, against all odds, learned to thrive. The story of the Paleogene is not just ancient history, it's a rehearsal, and in many ways, we're standing on the same stage. The parallels are eerie. During the early Paleogenes, the Earth was hot, sweltering, tropical, lush. Palm trees grew near the poles, crocodiles basked in what is now Canada, and the air was thick with moisture. Then came the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, a sudden spike in global temperature caused by a massive release of carbon into the atmosphere. Sound familiar? It's the ancient echo of our own crisis. The planet warmed rapidly, oceans acidified, and countless species struggled to keep up. It was climate change before anyone had invented smokestacks or fossil fuels, proof that the Earth doesn't need humans to wobble, but the humans are now accelerating the wobble faster than nature ever intended. Back then, life adapted, but only barely. It took tens of thousands of years for temperatures to stabilize and millions for ecosystems to fully recover. Some species vanished forever, unable to evolve quickly enough. Others transformed. Mammals learned to regulate heat better. Plants altered their leaf shapes, and ocean creatures moved to cooler depths. Life, in its stubborn brilliance, found ways to continue. Yet it came at a cost: extinction and reinvention, loss and rediscovery. The Paleogene reminds us that resilience is real, but it isn't painless. Today we stand at a similar crossroads, only with a faster clock. The carbon that nature released over millennia, we've unleashed in mere centuries. The temperature curve that once rose gently now spikes like a fever. Ice sheets melt, seas rise, coral reefs bleach, and forests burn. It's the same pattern, only sped up by human hands. We've become the volcanoes now, the climate drivers, the agents of transformation. But unlike the mindless forces of the Paleogene, we have awareness. We can choose what happens next. There's a strange comfort in knowing the Earth has survived worse. The Paleogene endured meteor strikes, volcanic winters, global heat waves, and oceanic chaos. The planet didn't end. It shifted, it recovered, it reimagined life from scratch. But it also never recovered in exactly the same way. Once a species disappears, it doesn't reappear. Once an ecosystem collapses, it doesn't rebuild in its old form. The Earth is resilient, yes, but it never resets. It moves on. And the world that follows is always different. That's the real lesson of the Paleogene. Resilience is not restoration. The dinosaurs didn't return. The coral reefs of that era are gone, replaced by new ones. The forests that regrew after the Great Extinction were not the same. The creatures that inherited the Earth were not copies. They were experiments. Evolution doesn't hit undo. It creates something else entirely. So when we talk today about saving the planet, what we really mean is saving the version of the planet that we love, the one with us in it, the one with elephants and whales and rainforests, the one we understand. The Earth will endure, no matter what we do. The question is whether we will still belong to the version that comes next. In the Paleogene, nature learned the power of adaptation. After disaster came innovation. Mammals diversified. Plants evolved new ways to photosynthesize in shifting light. The oceans, after acidifying, developed a new food web. Life did not resist change. It danced with it, reluctantly at first, then gracefully. That's the paradox of survival. You don't stay alive by staying the same. And yet, for all its resilience, the Paleogene world was fragile too. Ecosystems were always on the brink, held together by the delicate balance of temperature, chemistry, and connection. A few degrees warmer or cooler, a shift in rainfall, a disruption in ocean currents. Any of these could tip the scales. Sound familiar again? The modern Earth, for all its complexity and abundance, teeters on the same edges. Coral reefs bleach when the seas warm by just 1 degree. Insects vanish when pesticides break the chain of pollination. Forests die when rains move a few hundred kilometers away. The line between thriving and collapse has always been thin. It's just that we're seeing it faster now, and still the world adapts. Plants adjust their blooming seasons, animals migrate earlier, microbes evolve resistance to new toxins. The same spirit that carried Plesiodapis through the Paleogene canopy and turned land mammals into whales is still here. It hasn't gone anywhere. Life always finds a way, but it needs time. The problem today is that we're taking time away. It's almost humorous, in a dark way. We like to imagine ourselves as the pinnacle of evolution, the smartest species ever to grace the planet. Yet we're testing the same lessons the Earth already taught 60 million years ago. Lesson 1. Don't mess with the carbon cycle. Lesson 2. Balance matters. Lesson 3. If you warm the oceans, prepare for surprises. The Earth is patient, but not indulgent. Still, humor has its place in humility. If a time traveler from the Paleogene could see our world today, they might laugh at how familiar it looks. We have global warming, mass migrations, and species in flux, just with skyscrapers and Wi-Fi added. The difference is that now, one species has the power to understand what's happening and still hesitates to act. Gastornis didn't debate environmental policy before crushing its prey. It simply followed instinct. We, on the other hand, know exactly what we're doing, and somehow that makes it harder. But the Paleogene also offers hope. After every upheaval, life returned. When the poles froze, new creatures adapted to the cold. When forests vanished, grasslands spread. When oceans acidified, new coral species evolved to handle it. Life does not give up. It reimagines, and that is our cue to reimagine our relationship with the planet. Not as conquerors, but as collaborators. We've learnt to split atoms and travel to other planets. But the hardest lesson is still the simplest. We depend on balance. The Paleogene Earth took millions of years to recover its equilibrium. We don't have that kind of time, but we do have understanding, and that's our advantage. We know what's at stake. We know how fragile the web of life is, and how astonishingly resilient it can be, if given a chance. Protecting biodiversity isn't just an act of kindness. It's an act of survival. Every species lost weakens the system we live in, just as removing one cog from a clock changes its rhythm. The Paleogene ecosystems recovered only because there were still enough cogs left, enough diversity to rebuild, enough connections to restart the cycle. We are the inheritors of that chain, the beneficiaries of 66 million years of resilience. If we break too many links, the chain might not reform. But the story isn't one of despair, it's one of choice. The Paleogene shows that life will always find a path forward. It's up to us, whether we travel with it or stand in its way. The climate will settle into a new pattern eventually. The Earth will stabilize. The question is what kind of world that stability will bring, and who will live in it. Will it still be a world of coral reefs and songbirds, or one of algae and silence? Perhaps the most humbling thing the Paleogene can teach us is perspective. For all our machines and satellites, we are still part of the same biological experiment that began in those ancient forests and seas. We're not separate from nature, we are nature. The carbon we burn once lived in plants that captured sunlight eons ago. The air we breathe has been exhaled by countless generations of creatures before us. The same forces that shaped Basilosaurus and Paracetherium still flow through us: adaptation, persistence, and curiosity. When we talk about climate change today, we're not just discussing data or policies. We're participating in the oldest story the Earth has ever told. How to live with change. The Paleogene was one of the planet's great experiments in resilience, and we are its latest chapter. The rules haven't changed. When balance is lost, the system shifts until it finds a new one. It doesn't ask for permission, but unlike the mammals and birds of that ancient world, we have foresight. We can see the patterns, measure the temperature, predict the consequences. We can decide whether to slow the change or accelerate it, and perhaps if we listen closely enough, we can still hear the Earth's quiet warning, a whisper carried through time: be careful. I've done this before. I always survive. But you might not. It's a sobering thought, but also an empowering one. The planet doesn't need saving in the absolute sense. It will endure. What it needs is stewardship, care, and time. The Paleogene reminds us that even after catastrophe, life endures through cooperation and adaptability. Those are the traits that carried tiny mammals through fire and darkness, that helped ancient whales find a home in the sea, that allowed forests to regrow from ashes. They're the same traits we need now. And yes, there's humor in it all too. The Earth, if it could wink, might say, "You're not the first to mess things up. Just don't make me start over." Because starting over is what the planet does best, but not what we want. So here we are, standing in the long shadow of the Paleogene, inheritors of its wisdom and its warnings. The story it tells is not about despair, but about resilience, the kind that bends without breaking, that finds new forms when the old ones fail. We are the latest test in that grand experiment. The question is whether we can prove that intelligence, unlike size or speed, can be a survival trait too. The Earth has shown us the way. Adapt, respect the balance, protect the web. Everything else follows. The Paleogene whispered it across eons, in stone and fossil and wind. Life is fragile, but it is also endlessly brave. And if we listen, truly listen, maybe we'll remember that we are part of that courage. The next chapter hasn't been written yet. The planet is waiting, patient, watchful, and humming with possibility. The question is, will we be part of it? And now, as the story comes to rest, let us linger in the soft afterlight of a world reborn. The Paleogene's 66 million years of motion, invention, and quiet determination was not just a chapter in Earth's history. It was a beginning, written in the language of survival. From the ashes of the KAPG extinction, where fire and silence once reigned, life rose again, smaller at first, humbler, but persistent. The mammals crept from their burrows, the birds took to the air, the trees stretched toward the sun once more. Out of chaos came rhythm, Out of ruin came design. It's astonishing, really, what the Earth can do with a little time. From the debris of an ending, it built something new, continents shifting and colliding to form mountains that would scrape the sky, oceans reorganizing their currents to sculpt the climate, and tiny bright-eyed creatures daring to imagine the world anew. The Alps rose, the whales learned to swim, the grasses found their courage and turned the deserts green. Even the primates, curious, agile, dream-filled, began their long, improbable journey toward us. The Paleogene was not gentle, but it was generous. It taught the Earth how to balance itself again, how to breathe after disaster. Every adaptation, every mutation, every trembling first step into a changed world was a testament to resilience. Where destruction had swept clean the slate, creation filled the void with wonder. That was its greatest gift, the proof that from loss, new possibilities grow. Tonight, as we drift towards sleep, imagine the echo of that age, the hush of ancient forests reborn from soot, the slow roll of continents still finding their place, the pulse of whales beneath young seas. We live in the afterglow of those moments. Every mountain peak, every blade of grass, every heartbeat in the night is part of that long, unbroken chain of renewal. The Paleogene reminds us that the Earth is never finished. It rebuilds itself endlessly, patiently, even beautifully. Each ending is an invitation to begin again. If the planet could whisper one last thought from that distant age, perhaps it would say, "Start over, grow again, there's still light after the darkness." So, breathe deeply, wherever you are, on a warm bed, a quiet sofa, or beneath a ceiling of stars. The same sky that watched the Paleogene dawn watches over you now. We are, all of us, children of that long recovery, shaped by its courage and carried by its light. If you've journeyed this far, thank you for wandering through deep time together. If you enjoyed the story, share it, let others feel that ancient pulse of wonder. And as your eyes grow heavy, remember, even after extinction, even after night, the world finds a way to begin again. Sleep well, dream of the newborn Earth, and rest in the gentle truth that every morning, like every epoch, is another Paleogen. The light always returns.